Jean Robin, écoute la chanson d'Emma Domas, Tu seras, et imagine que c'est Dieu qui s'adresse directement à toi. Et écoute aussi la chanson de Jennifer de la Star Academy, Ma Révolution. Tu comprendras l'hégélianisme culturel, cultural Hegelianism. Tu parles anglais, donc espérons que tu arriveras à saisir la complexité des informations dans un temps réduit et que tu parviendras à faire des convertis peut-être en France ou ailleurs. En tout cas, tu as un rôle important à jouer et la raison pour laquelle tu as eu des expériences spirituelles, c'est que euh, tu as visité ou tu as compris la phénoménologie de l'esprit français, c'est-à-dire le développement de la conscience dans le milieu politique, culturel et religieux de la France du 21e siècle. Disons les choses simplement. Voilà. Donc j'ai vu dans une de tes vidéos que que tu connaissais Hegel. J'ai pas le temps de faire un cours sur Hegel, mais si tu tombes sur ma chaîne où je fais des vidéos principalement en anglais, Cultural Hegelianism, ou bien Eternal Light, euh, tu, tu comprendras si tu as l'opportunité de lire, de méditer et de voir mes vidéos. Les plus récentes sont les plus développées d'un point de vue intellectuel. Voilà. Donc peut-être nous reverrons-nous autre part, on verra bien. Donc voilà. Dieu te fait confiance, Jean. Okay, in this video I will talk about the way of understanding and grasping the intellectual and spiritual life of a country, and I will not post the video immediately because I have still work to do, but it will be part of an editing video probably. And here is just the broad view. I will begin by talking about the broad view of being, namely nature and Geist, and I will zoom to see more clearly. Then I will talk about the logical determinations of the concept, universality, particularity, and singularity. And finally, I will illustrate what the intellectual and spiritual life of a country is with the example of modern 21st century France, and I will fully detail, I mean not fully, but I will talk about the broad tendencies, the general tendencies of the country, which can be applied to many other Western countries and eventually to all other countries. But I will begin with the broad presentation of the process of being becoming conscious of itself, which is a formal definition of God. So here we have in green the philosophy of nature, in purple and pink the philosophy of Geist, in blue in the middle we have objective spirit, which is the realm of institutions, and here in the top corner we have art, religion and philosophy, which is the manifestation of the divine through in its highest form, one might say. So I will briefly talk about, I will not detail, but nature. Nature can be envisioned as the realm of mechanics, and here are the categories of the modern sciences. So nature is spatially and temporally determined. It's the realm of matter, movement, energy, the forces of physics, gravitational force, which is not strictly speaking a force, but the curvature of space-time, the electromagnetic force, the weak and strong interactions, and then the sub-branches of physics, optics, thermodynamics, acoustics, etc., etc., electromagnetism. So it's logically structured, and I just, in a dark green, these are the determinations of the encyclopedia, and in clear light green, these are the categories that one would use in the modern jargon, the modern sciences, which explain the process of nature. So nature is the totality of all these determinations, basically. And here we have organic physics, which we call biology. So here we have the geological nature. Here the biological, strictly speaking, and out of this natural out of these natural determinations emerge chronologically in the official storyline man, which is an anthropological creature who is determined anatomically, physiologically, zoologically, because human beings are animals, they are thinking animals, but animals nonetheless. And here are the main determinations of human beings: anthropological, determinations of consciousness. Here it's written in German, but I will not translate for now because it's not necessary for now. And here the determinations of psychology. So here it's the anthropological, psychosocial, conscious, and psychological determinations of man. And all these determinations, they bring about a collective life, that which we could call Sittlichkeit, which is being made manifest through objective spirit. So all these determinations are determinations of objective spirit, namely the way man makes his mind and his spirit and his soul eventually objective to himself and to others in a collective structure, in an ordering of reality, namely in a collective life. And here I will not detail, but a society, it is valid for each singular society, but it's valid for the total collective self of mankind, basically. These are a society, a country is an interconnected totality with all these determinations. I will not detail because I have already done this in other videos, and I will, when I post this video, I will put the link to videos where I talk more thoroughly and in more detail. So it's just a broad view, and if necessary during the coming minutes or hours, depending on how long I talk, if it is necessary, you can come back to this moment to have the broad view of what I envision when I talk about the collective life of a people. So to simplify, a people inhabits a geological habitat, an ecological habitat, which is the product of all the determinations of nature, but a people is first anthropologically and psychologically determined and eventually brings about institutions, and there is a reciprocal determination between the institutions, the natural environment, the people and its psychology and its demographics, etc. There is a reciprocal determination. It's not one-sided. All the parts of the totality, they are interconnected in a way. And here at the top we should have logic, but logic is the process of reconstructing itself, basically. So yeah, I will pause and now I will talk briefly about the logic of the concept. Okay, so here I illustrate very simply, very briefly, the logical distinctions of universal, particular, singular. It's the same here and there. It's just to illustrate. The universal is that which is valid for all the Bestimmtheit of a given universal, namely all the universal can be a genus in biology, it can be a determination of Geist, like a law or ethics, etc. It can be a topic of inquiry, it can be a branch of the sciences, etc., etc. And this is just a formal dividing of reality. Every object is free in one because it is a singularized universal through the mediation of a particularity. And the universal limits itself, gives itself boundaries, limitations through its particularization, but it remains what it is, namely the universal is contained within the particular, and the singular is contained, the particular is contained within the singular, therefore the universal is contained within the singular. So each particular is a particularization of the universal, and each singular is a singularization of the particular, and therefore each singular is also a singularization of the universal. But when we go from top from up to down, there is a process of limitation and giving itself boundaries, but a determination also. So namely, what is singular is fully determined, it's concrete, it's wirklich. Whereas what is particular or universal is more abstract, and the universal comes down to singularity through a process of determination, and the singular elevates itself to the particular and to the universal through a process of abstraction. And here I have illustrations. If you take, because this is what I intend to talk about in this video, if you take the example of the universal can be, for instance, a Western country or Western countries. Then the various particularities are European countries or a European country or European countries, Northern American and others. Here you have, for instance, Germany, England, France, and all the European countries, which are Western countries. But there are Western countries on the Northern American continent, namely US and Canada, and there are others who are considered Western in the Southern Hemisphere, New Zealand, Australia, and depending on what the Bestimmtheit means here, Western, is it economic, is it political, is it anthropological, is it cultural? Because that's why Japan is in a different color, because depending on what is meant by the Bestimmtheit Western country, one can say that Japan is a Western country and it belongs with others, or not. And I could have added Israel, even I wouldn't say the Saudi, the Arabic states, because they are not really Western, but they are Westernized in the sense that they are modern and highly developed. So depending on what is meant by the Bestimmtheit Western, is it technological development and prosperity? In this case, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, these might be Western countries. But if Western means historically populated by Europeans, then Japan is not a Western country. If it means the Bestimmtheit of the Cold War, namely the countries who opposed the USSR and who are not third world countries, then Japan is a Western country. So that's why it's important to define the Bestimmtheit. And here I can add. So if the Bestimmtheit is the geopolitical determinations of the Cold War, European countries eastward of Germany, like Poland, Slovakia, Ukraine, Moldova, etc., the Baltic countries, they wouldn't be Western if the Japan would be Western, but Poland wouldn't if the determinacy is USSR versus the West, which is the past between 1945 and 1989 broadly. So here, countries which have historically been populated by Europeans, and here the particular can itself be subdivided. It can be particularized again in a way. And here these are anthropological determinations. Here, so we have countries which historically have been populated by Nordic Europeans, and there are Nordics in Switzerland and France, and most of the native inhabitants of these countries are Nordic. Of these people, of these countries, they are European, but not Nordic, although there are also Nordics here, but in a less significant proportion, which is a quantitative Verhältnis, a quantitative determination. Here, the divide is geological in a way, continental, I mean it's geographical, North America versus South America. So it's not anthropological, it's geographical. And here, if you subdivide the particularity of countries populated by Europeans, particularity is on the American continent, you can sub-particularize northern, southern. I could have taken Protestant, Catholic, basically. And there are others, Australia, New Zealand, and here there's South Africa, which has been populated over the past centuries by Europeans, but in a tiny proportion, which is a determination of quantitative Verhältnis. So this is an illustration. So I drew this very simple table to show that I will talk about a singular country in this video, namely the intellectual and spiritual life of France. And France is a country, so what I say about France is valid for all countries, but France is also particularized, namely there are various particularities. It's a Western country, a country of the European continent, historically populated by Europeans, but it's also historically a Catholic country. It's a country which has a Celtic tradition prior to Christianity. It's a country which is economically socialist, so these are a particularity of economics. This is a country which has borders with at least 5, I don't know exactly, with several other countries. So any determinacy can be taken. It's a country who has less than 100 million inhabitants. It's a country which has more than 30 million inhabitants. So the particularity, because if you choose the universal country, every country is a country. But here I will talk about France as a singular country, and the particularity that I will focus mostly upon is that it's a modern Western country with the determinations of the modern Western life, which are shared by, not by Japan, but by most of these countries, namely all Western European countries, and Northern American, and Australian, New Zealand, and partly South Africa. So this is what I'm going to talk about. That was just to show the broad picture. It's been 15 minutes, now I can begin. Okay, this is the broad picture. I will zoom, but first I will just make a brief comment. In order to understand a country, I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that one has to live within the country, at least momentarily or temporarily, because to understand the spirit, the geist of a nation, which is made manifest, I will not go back to objective and absolute spirit, but in the institutions, also the language, being in contact with the native population, being in contact with maybe the natural environment, and also with the works of art, the history, it's the immaterial substance which some people say it does not exist, the folk geist, it does not exist, but actually it does, because the reason why people say the spirit of a people or of a nation does not exist, whatever is meant by existence, is because it's so difficult to grasp, it's so subtle, because it's not easily quantified. It cannot be quantified, or it's very difficult to quantify, and also it's very subtle, very it's immaterial, so it's very difficult. That's why only someone who has grown in a country, or who has spent a sufficient amount of time in a country, and maybe whose native language is the language of the country, can understand fully the spirit of a people. In this sense, I do not identify as a Frenchman metaphysically, I identify as a German, and culturally I am an American, basically, but also French, but my culture is mostly American. My references, my cultural references, they are American or Anglo-Saxon, and my scientific references as well. So metaphysically I'm a German, scientifically in the ordinary sense, and culturally I'm an Anglo-Saxon or an American, but empirically I'm a Frenchman. And I will just briefly talk about a few things, like to grow up in a country, to go through the educational system, to talk with the ordinary people, to read the news, to watch TV or watch videos on the internet in one's own native language. It's an experience that only a native person, not anthropologically, a native spiritual person, namely whatever the origin is, someone who has grown up in France and speaks the French language fluently, only he or she can understand. And it's valid for every country. Only a person who is born and raised in Bulgaria or Botswana or Bolivia. I chose countries with the B letter, but that was not planned, but whatever. Only a person who is native to the country, not anthropologically, namely, it's not a question of race or ethnicity, it's a question of geist, of spirit in a sense, namely of language and habits and Sittlichkeit in a way, can understand a country. And in this sense, I will take examples. I can empirically, I am unable to know what it is like for a native English speaking person. What is the difference between, for instance, what is the difference for a native Englishman? What is the difference between the Canadians and the Americans, the Scots and the Irish? I can know the objective differences, like by studying the history of these countries, etc. Of course, but what I mean is, I cannot empirically, and this is a universal experience, I cannot know what it's like for a native English person to think subjectively, one might say, about the Americans and the Canadians, in a sense. I don't know how they envision one another, and I will take an example. I can only guess or envision that the relationship here between Americans and Canadians, I will use an analogical reasoning, that's a determination of logic, reasoning by analogy, namely that I can only imagine that the Canadians are to the Americans what the Belgians are to the French. Namely, Belgium is a country next to France, a tiny country, where a part of the population speaks French, and they have a weird accent. But basically, they are, or like the Swiss, the French-speaking Swiss population. for a native speaking French person, a Swiss speaking a French speaking Swiss or a French speaking Belgian, they may have a weird accent, but they are not very different. They are not very different anthropologically. They have different values. So this would be the realm of objective spirit, but they are kind of here I will make a dubious remark, but they are kind of insignificant neighbors. Like, hey, we are the French. You are only Belgians. That's the tiny country. You invented French fries, but we rule this part of Europe. And I can only imagine that the typical arrogant white American thinks of the Canadian as some sort of the Belgians of Northern America, and he probably thinks the Canadians, well, they invented maple syrup, and Jordan Peterson, I don't know which one is best. But I can only imagine that the arrogant white American thinks of the white Canadians, well, they are second-class neighbors, basically. I'm caricaturing, but actually, seriously, what I mean is that only a native Canadian or a native American, or I can use the determination of the English Isles, the British, the English, the Irish, only a native person, here I talk mostly about language, can know what it's like to be able to understand the language of another country, basically. So in this sense, I am trapped by my native language, and so is everyone else, basically. That's what I wanted to say. So, yeah. And there are determinations of the spiritual life of a country that only a native person, not anthropologically, but a native cultural person can understand. For instance, multiculturalism versus assimilation. The doctrine of France is to assimilate the immigrants. The values of the Republic, as we call this, is what the American called probably the liberal values, but it's typical to France. It's a particularization of a universal set of leftist values, but it's like a trigger word. Les valeurs de la République is in the mind of a Frenchman. It's what the American understand when we say diversity is our strength. Basically, it's a motto that everyone repeats without understanding. I will talk briefly about the relationship to America. In France, most people hate, most educated people, they hate America. But here, the perspective of a native cultural Frenchman is important for the Americans, because what the educated members of the French society call America is what the native Americans, I'm not here talking about the native Indian, I'm talking about the native, mostly white Americans, cultural Americans, what they call the elites. So basically, the French elite hate America, and what they call America is what the people of the US call the elites, and those who are on the right-wing spheres, they call this the you-know-who's, basically. And if you told to the Frenchman, okay, what you hate about America, is basically what the Germans didn't like about some people a few decades back in the 20th century, they would be frightened. That's why it's easy to hate America from a French perspective, but yeah, that's why it's important to have a reciprocal exchange of points of view. Basically, that may be the purpose of existence. Of here, I'll praise, I don't know, but I will defend the negative from a philosophical standpoint, not from a moral standpoint, but from a philosophical standpoint. In order to see anything, there has to be a negative relationship, namely a distanciation, a separation, a particularization, and it is only through this negativity, not in the moral sense, but in the epistemological sense, that knowledge and awareness becomes possible. I understood a lot about France by reading Lothrop Stoddard, who was an American journalist interested in anthropology, and only an author can give to oneself a sense of self which is fully adequate in a way. So here I give the perspective of a Frenchman about French intellectual and spiritual life in the early years and the decades of the 21st century. I will begin with the left. So I have classified, and if you remember what I said earlier, so in red, these are living people. In black, these are dead people. And they are all French. They are not anthropologically French necessarily, depending on what you mean by that, but they all speak French fluently and they are culturally French. But there are people of various ethnicities or races. There are Europeans, people of Jewish background. There are Africans, Northern Africans, probably even Asians, etc. But I will talk about. So here is the left. I divided in left, right, but it's more subtle than that, and I will systematically comment as briefly as possible for someone who is not aware, but the life of France, and because it's a singular country through the mediation of the particularization of a Western country, it is valid partly for most Western countries. That's why I give my perspective, and those who are native inhabitants of another Western countries will be able to understand what is common or uncommon, which in logical language means identical or different, in their own native country. So I begin with the political media circus, what people sometimes call the system. So there is the system basically means the media and the politicians, the political political circus and the media. And here you have some organic intellectuals of the system, namely people who are whose role consists in spreading the ideas of the system. If you want to see what a system is, go back to the beginning of the video, the objective spirit and the interconnectedness of all spheres of life. So I will not detail fully. So here you have organic intellectuals. It exists in every country. Every country with a developed intellectual life and a developed organization of institutions, there are intellectuals whose role consists in spreading the dominant ideology. This is what Karl Marx said in one of his books, namely that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, basically. So here are some intellectuals who just spread the ideology of the system. Yeah, and which is tolerance, welcoming immigrants, equality, feminism, being open, cosmopolitan values, modernity, liberal values, both economically and socially. These are the dominant leftist values of the West, basically. And some names are famous outside of France, like Piketty, for instance. But he's more famous outside of France than in France. It happens, we'll see, with many leftist intellectuals in France, many French intellectuals, whether they are left or right, they are sometimes more famous outside of France than within France. So, yeah, the ideology in France could be considered liberal-libertaire, which means liberal from an economic perspective, although it's not true, as I will show. And libertaire doesn't mean libertarian, it means liberal in a moral sense. Namely, the libertaire means left-wing libertarian in terms of values within the American context. So liberal-libertaire is not libertarianism, it's what the Americans call liberals, basically. Plus, so the system, it's liberal-libertaire plus socialists, basically. Because France is, if you had to particularize the economic system of France, but I will develop further, it's basically a socialist country. Modern France is successful socialism, as successful as it can get with all the inherent contradictions of socialism. So here these are examples of organic intellectuals. Here we have examples of the cosmopolitan elites, Sarkozy and Hollande. They claim to be opposed, but they are on the same team, actually. These people, they are united by a common rejection of the native working class, the white working class. This is a common feature of most, if not all, Western countries, namely the elites are united against the economic and cultural interests of the native white working class. So that's typical, like in America, England, like every Western country. Yeah, but the difference between the French life and the American life is that the question of race is not debated. I mean, it's becoming more and more widespread in public debate, but it's kind of an embarrassment. In France, people do not talk about race. It's like an insult to talk about race. It's not really, but because of the history of France, race is not like it's not. It cannot be. I mean, people can use even using the word race is kind of suspicious and dubious. So there is a taboo around the question of race, which does not exist in America. Yeah. Then the main topics which are being discussed, of course, are colonialism and collaboration during the Holocaust. So the French are constantly being accused by the elites and the intellectuals of having collaborated with the Nazis and being a country of colonialism, of having colonized Africa. So there is no, I mean, slavery partly, but the sin of France, from a political standpoint, is colonialism and collaboration with the Nazis, basically. Yeah. So it's the fundamental determinations are moral terror, shame, repentance. It's the elite, the intellectuals and the elite. They accuse the people, the working class, of being. They do not do this directly, but they shame them constantly by reminding them the darkest hours of our history when we collaborated with the Nazis. The French state under Pétain in the 1940s, when France was partly allied, because it was partly allied with Germany, when they collaborated with the Nazis to hunt the Jews, etc. So this is moral terror, which is used almost daily. It works in every Western country, but you cannot accuse the French of segregation or genocide of the native population, so they are accused of colonialism and having collaborated with the Nazis, basically, which enables to prevent all the crimes that are being perpetrated by some desocialized immigrants, the lumpen proletariat, namely the dangerous elements which are not assimilated and who are outcast, basically, because they do not belong to society, because they have not found a job, or because they suffer from various problems. They perpetrate crimes. Not only them, there are whites who perpetrate crimes as well, of course, but there is a proportion of desocialized immigrants or descendants of immigrants who perpetrate crimes, and they are being made innocent because the constant accusation in the public life is the past crimes of the French, basically. Yeah. Then we have also an anti-racist woke left, but it doesn't work exactly like in the US, because these people, these are just examples, they are kind of fake in the sense that the French, they have their own pride in the sense that they want to self-flagellate, like every good white people, basically, but they still have their pride. They say, we are French, we are not Americans, so this woke bullshit, we won't take that in France. We have our own way of self-flagellation, of self-moral mutilation, but the woke ideology, it's spreading more and more with the newer generation who get influenced by American campuses and American news and American entertainment. But the woke ideology, namely the idea that the white race is inherently guilty, it doesn't really work in France, because the question of race is such a taboo. So if the elites or the intellectuals started really to develop the woke ideology, it would be kind of dangerous, because the people are not supposed to know that they are white in France. It's so outside of ordinary consciousness that if you introduce the question of race, you have the one-sided aspect of self-flagellation for all the crimes of the white race, but also you have the other aspect, namely it might awaken racial pride, which would be problematic. So that's why the woke ideology, it exists, and the Grund is the American ideology, but it's not very widespread. Of course, there's the brand of feminism, but then again, this is French pride in the good sense. Pride is a sin for the Christians, but it's good in the sense that there is the particular branch of of feminism, namely the French have a history of feminism. So here I noted there is the up to down feminism, namely the up would be American campuses and down would be the particularization of the ideology of American campuses, Judith Butler and etc. etc. That would be imported feminism, imported mostly from American campuses, but it doesn't really work in France. We have our native brand of feminism, namely the French people historically has developed its own brand of feminism, and here it can be partly praised. There are Olympe de Gouges, who was a French revolutionary woman in the 18th century. There is Georges Sand, who was a French female writer of the 19th century, and Simone de Beauvoir. One can think whatever one wants, but these are native French women who were not influenced by American ideology, basically, and there have been great female achievements in French history, like Madame. I forgot her name. She helped Voltaire translate the works of Newton. Marie Curie, who was a Polish singer. So there are great French women. Joan of Arc, of course. Marie Antoinette. Well, yeah. Great French poetress. So there have been great French women. So if feminism is not necessarily bad, but if it has to be good, the French people have reasons to be proud of their feminist history, in a sense. So the American type of feminism would be in the woke ideology, but we have here partly, these persons, they are partly influenced by the woke ideology, but there is a good, if you have to use good versus bad, good would be what is homegrown. We have our own brand of homegrown feminism. Here you have the ecologists, bobo, vegan. Bobo means bourgeois bohème. It cannot be translated, but basically that's privileged white liberals, basically. They want to distantiate themselves, these people, from the white working class. It's a sociological competition. They acquire their sense of identity by differentiating themselves from the lower class of their own ethnic group. That's why identity and difference are conceptually united. So they do everything they can to separate themselves in terms of status. So they adopt the most ludicrous ideology just to say, I am different from those working people who have to toil all day and pay their bills and who speak in a vulgar language, etc. We are refined, we have a brand new ideology, anti-speciesism, the most various kinds of anti-racism, Islamophilia, they love Muslims. Their ideology is completely antagonistic with the view of ordinary Muslims and even more with radical Islam, but they are in league with the Muslims because unconsciously they just want to annoy the white working class. This is the psychological characteristic of these people, and they exist in every Western country. They are really the most ludicrous, one might say, but actually it's logical. It's simply a sociological struggle for status, and the more ludicrous the ideology is, the adopted ideology is, the more further away from the ordinary life of the native working population, the more they distinguish themselves and the more they are praised by the system. Basically, that's how it works. Then, of course, there are the stupid leftist teenagers. Most white people have been or were stupid teenagers, a stupid leftist when they were teenagers. That's part of the learning curve. Here we have anti-colonialists. They call themselves les indigènes de la République, which literally means the indigenous of the Republic, which actually is contradictory because the indigenous are those who are born on the soil. So basically these people are not indigenous, they are exogenous, but that's why they are whatever. But these are people of African origin who are French citizens, but whose parents or grandparents arrived in the last few decades, and they are partly resentful against France for its colonial history, for having invaded and dominated and murdered their ancestors, basically, or enslaved their ancestors, or enslaved not necessarily literally, but dominated economically and politically to the point that it was they were second-class citizens, their ancestors. or what they identify as their ancestors. So they are partly resentful or angry against France, which can be understood because France caused harm to the country of these are just examples, but France caused harm to some African countries. It's not just negative, but there have been a negative history with African countries through colonialism in the 19th century mostly. And they are tolerated by the system. That's why they are in the political media circus, because their struggle, which is anti-French struggle and the struggle of the intellectuals and the elites, they are the same. That's why these people, they are tolerated and they are invited on the TV shows. But the problem is that they are, some of them are open nationalists, but not French nationalists, but African nationalists. And that's why it's ambiguous, because the system is opposed officially to nationalism, but it tolerates forms of nationalism to the extent that it is opposed to French nationalism. So that's a manipulation of the system that's very smart. But when people like Kemi Seba becomes really nationalist and wants to defend the interests of his people, he's a Pan-African thinker, he's no longer invited by the system, because there is a limit to the level of tolerance for nationalism, basically, even if it's African nationalism. Here we have the theatrical is my translation of spectaculaire, not in the sense of amazing, but spectacle means the show, like the ideology of Guy Debord, la société du spectacle, could be translated by theatrical, namely it's theatricality, it's kind of a comedy. It can be a sinister comedy, but it's a play. So the theatrical far left would be the far left, which is tolerated by the political circus. And here we have contradictions again. So there are contradictions everywhere, like I said, contradictions between French ideology and American ideology in the woke, feminist, and woke and feminist ideology, contradiction between anti-nationalism of the system and nationalism of the non-native, or those who do not identify as native people. And here we have contradictions because the far left is tolerated by the system, but there are opposite poles. There are the Islamophobes, those who reject Islam, and those who are Islamophiles. And Charlie Hebdo, they were Islamophobic, but the Muslims did not find the radical, not the Muslim, the radical Muslim, the radical Muslim terrorists, who were also here are ordinary, well-integrated Muslims. Here are radical Muslims, and here in the middle between the two, the desocialized members of the Muslim community might become radicalized and might eventually become terrorists. And this is the story of most terrorist incidents in France over the past few years. So these people, they are descendants, ideological descendants of May 1968. So their ideological software is the values of May 68. So they are liberal, libertaire, kind of hedonistic, nihilistic leftist, basically. But these people, they are serious. And these people, they are clowns. And a tragedy occurred when the terrorists desocialized immigrants who had been radicalized by Islam, when they murdered one of the symbols of the system, namely the French freedom of expression, in the sense of being Voltairian, namely a little bit antagonistic in one way of talking. So yeah, this is they are on the same side because they are on the left, but there are many contradictions within the leftist system, and this can only be understood in the French context. It's a particularity of French life and maybe of some other European Western countries, but the contradictions brought about by the presence of Muslims who sometimes are desocialized and radicalized is only present in an extended way in Western countries. It does not exist. I mean, it does partly, but it's not as prevalent in America, for instance. And here you have the leftist newspapers who spread the ideology of the elite, basically. Yeah, so just these theatrical far left, they are anti-Catholic. So basically, they are the left of the end of the 19th century and the mid 20th century. So they are struggling against the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church in France is a ghost. It no longer it's not powerful at all. So they are fighting against windmills, like Don Quixote. They are fighting against ghosts and windmills. They are denouncing the Catholic history of France because this is what the system allows them to do. But the Catholics, as of now, they have no power in France. So they are struggling against windmills or ghosts or specters, basically. That's why they are theatrical in spite of the drama, because then here we have also the Islamophiles. So these far left communists, they are programmed by the ideology of the elites, but they so they cannot be allied with the white working class. So they are forced to seek another proletariat, and they seek their proletariat in the desocialized, what Marx would call the lumpen proletariats, or even the radical forms of Islam. So here we have atheistic communism allied with radical Islam. So it's a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. Only from a Hegelian perspective it's logical, namely that atheists, radical far left communist atheists, become united with radical Muslims in a way. And here you have the anti-clergy far left, and here you have the atheistic far left, and they are anti-Islam and they are pro-Islam. And they are in the same subcategory. That's why there are contradictions everywhere. So here are the newspapers, here the far left, the liberal far left, and this is supposed to be a centrist view, but actually it's far left as well. Those who control Le Monde, which is the main newspaper in France, they are former Maoist or former communist. So neutrality in France is on the far left of the spectrum, basically. In terms of values, it's far left. And here the question of boomers. So here we have the leftist opposition. So here it's the dominant system in terms of ideology, but there is an opposition because the system can only maintain itself by faking an opposition. So this is the leftist opposition, which is tolerated by the system. And here we have the Islamo-skeptical left. So they are Islamophobes, but they are more serious in a sense, and they are mostly French citizens of Jewish background, because Jews have been victims of attacks by radical, desocialized Muslim descendants of immigrants who have perpetrated acts of violence against members of the Jewish community. So there are a proportion of the Jewish community in France who feels threatened by Islam, and that's why there is an Islamo-skeptical left. And also, historically, France has been a Catholic country from the end of the 5th century up until the end of the 18th century, so for 13 centuries broadly. In the 19th century, an anti-clergy, anti-religious movement, which started, metaphysically it started with Descartes and then with the Enlightenment, but mostly with the French Revolution it became political, and throughout the 19th century the struggle in France was the Republicans against the clergy. So Republican in France means civic nationalism or civic patriotism. It doesn't mean what Republican means in America. It's different. The Republicans historically in France have been on the left, and that's why today the conservative movement in France, the respectable conservative movement, which is also included in the media circles. Here I could add all the names of all the politicians, of course, all the politicians of the system. So the conservative movement in France is called Les Républicains, like in America, because the French are trying to replicate American political life, but Republican in French means civic patriotism or civic nationalism even. And that's why the leftists, the intelligent leftists, they are very attached to the notion of the Republic. For them, the Republic means tolerance, equality, feminism, white guilt, immigration. For them, republic means what it meant in the 19th century, namely public education, a sense of civic virtue, civic duty, etc., etc. So, yeah. Here is the conservative left, and I know that this exists in every Western country, namely these are intellectuals, sociologists, who are defending the working class, whether they are immigrants. There are not only Muslim immigrants in France, there are immigrants of many nationalities, but most immigrants are religiously Muslim. So these conservative leftists, they are defending the working class, which is still predominantly white. It's quantitative Verhältnis, the proportion, the measure is still majoritarily white, but the proportion of non-native French, anthropologically native French persons, namely descendants of immigrants who arrived during the past 50 years, is increasing. So these people, they are defending the working class independently of any question of ethnicity, but they are defending them on economic grounds. So they are conservative socialists in a way, one might say, conservative socialists, and they are tolerated by the political media circus because the circus understands that in order to maintain itself, it has to leave a little bit of room for the white working class, because these people, they live by, all these people, actually the entire system, live by exploiting the sweat and work of the working class. This is a Marxist analysis, namely the elites, they thrive because they exploit the people. That's how it works. So these people, they are taking side with the people, but not with the anthropological people, with the economic people, namely working class and lower middle class. And that's why they are tolerated, because they do not talk about ethnicity, or sometimes they do, but in a very diplomatic way. But the system understands that it has to leave a little bit of room for opposition in the economic sphere, because otherwise it would be problematic. So there are a lot of decent workers who are attracted by these thinkers, directly or indirectly, because they offer a message of hope, of improving the economic conditions, and a peaceful cooperation between the ordinary immigrants, who are mostly Muslim, and the ordinary native French workers, on the condition that the economic conditions precisely be improved. So that's a conservative socialist left, and it exists in every Western country. Partly Bernie Sanders, because we have here the ideological bourgeois left. These people, they are bourgeois, and these people, they are also bourgeois because they are academics and scholars, but they defend the workers, basically. Here we have the theatrical pro-sovereignty left. So sovereignty is a debate which is particular to France and to Western European countries. Namely, it's the struggle of the political institutions and the political independence of France versus the subordination to the European Union. So who should rule? Is it France or Brussels, namely the institutions of the European Union? So these people, they are tolerated by the system because the European Union has had a detrimental effect upon the economics and political life and independence of France. So the system has to leave a little bit of room for criticism. But these people are not really serious. Like they talk about the EU, etc., but they are not really serious. They just their entire mind is focused on the problem is the EU. So they focus all the problems of terrorism, problems of economic degradation, problems of anti-racism, problems of all sorts of problems. They say we have the one solution. Frexit, leave the European Union and everything is going to be okay. I simplify. Here's the right-wing cosmopolitan opposition to the system. So you have the leftist sovereignty and right-wing sovereignty, but if you see the picture, the right-wing, they are the right-wing, they are on the side. The right wing, they are on the side of the left, because they are right wingers from the perspective of the system, but actually they are leftist. These people are cosmopolitan. So Marine Le Pen, I don't know how foreigners envision her, but basically she's a leftist. She's a cosmopolitan leftist, the far right of the system. If we use the categories of common sense, this is actually the left. In America, Marine Le Pen would be on the left wing. Economically, she would be on the left wing of the Democratic Party. She would be in America, she would almost be considered a communist, basically, her economic policies. And in terms of values about immigration, culture, etc., she's on the far right of the system, but actually she's a leftist. And here I will. This is what on the right we have Mr. Delesquin, who is kind of a liberal nationalist, who said famously for the French that Marine Le Pen is a leftist woman. She has no culture. What she enjoys, I will try to translate this into English because it's funny. What she enjoys is dancing in nightclubs while listening to African music. And there's nothing wrong. African music is great, but that's what she does. She's a leftist with no culture who enjoys dancing in nightclubs listening to African music, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. So here, a growing proportion of the population is Muslim, but the Muslims, if you take into account their ethical determinations and values, the Muslims, they are on the far right. Most of them, they are traditionalists, namely they have a sense of values, marriage, solidarity, religious life. I'm not idealizing them. They are not all extraordinary, virtuous people, but most of them are virtuous and religious and decent and traditionalist. But they are on the left side of the political divide, because it is mostly around the question of demographics, basically. So it's the perspective of white Frenchmen. The system is seen from the perspective of whites, but in the Muslim communities, the far right, a radical Muslim, not a dissociative, but a radical Islamist, from the perspective of a Muslim society, who would be on the far right, but from the perspective of a Western society, he's on the left, basically. So that's why it depends on the Bestimmtheit that one chooses. But the Muslims, they are defended by the system and by the left, except by some Islamophobes here and some Islamoscepticals here. But yeah, and so someone like Marine Le Pen has to constantly say that the Muslims are part of the French community, part of the French nation, etc. That's why she's hated on the far right and on the right, and that's why she's tolerated by the system, because she plays by the rules. Here we have a theatrical communist, namely people who advocate more or less forms of communism, but it's in order to be accepted in the political media circus, it's not very serious. Badiou is famous in America. He's a former Maoist, so it's okay in France to be a Maoist. Mao was probably the greatest mass murderer in terms of quantitative numbers. It's okay to be a Maoist as long as one does not criticize the broad values of the system, namely tolerance, equality, immigration, etc., etc. So these are kind of fake communism, fake communist. Here are half serious communists. They are here. The serious communists, they have read Hegel, and here they haven't read Hegel. So they are intellectually gifted and very intelligent. This person was murdered during the Charlie Hebdo attack by radical, desocialized people. So he was a valued economist. So these people, they are economically communist, one could say, and they are very intelligent, but they are not classical communists, namely they haven't the Hegelian software in their mind. Here we have a theatrical anarchist, namely anarchists, teenage anarchists. Here's a doctor who converted himself to anarchism. Yeah, so it's kind of black blocs. They are not black blocs, but we could have black blocs, namely the forces of chaos from the left, which are tolerated by the system because it enables the repression from the police forces. It enables to terrorize the population while collaborating secretly with them.
So that's why they are accepted by the system, because they are a part of chaos within the established chaos of the system. But because it is established, it is no longer chaos. It's order, actually. It's an orderly chaos. It's what some Anglo-Saxons call anarcho-tyranny. So these are the agents of anarcho-tyranny. And that's why they are tolerated and even sometimes promoted by the system. That's why the system tolerates anarchy in its theatrical form. But the real anarchy, namely the people who really want to emancipate the workers, they are not really tolerated. And here we have, here just to mention, these people, they are not necessarily leftist. The left, the political dichotomy are only the three spheres. So here, a leftist opposition which is rejected by the system, and therefore, because it is rejected by the system, it becomes de facto far right. So in this list, these are radical leftists who, because of a Hegelian process of the unity of opposites, they are far right. So these people, they have grown and developed as left-wingers, socialists, communists, etc. But in the context of the system, they are far right in a sense, not because they are nationalist or racist, but because they are reactionary. So here we have reactionary socialists who defend traditional values like good education, good culture, moral values, etc. Here are modern, young. The divide here is between younger people and older generation. So here people are pro-sovereignty, like they think about sovereignty, but not in a theatrical way. They are serious about the sovereignty of France, and that's why they are not accepted by the system, because they really want to emancipate themselves from the European Union. Here are the Islamophobic left. So here, this Islamoscepticism is tolerated by the system, and mostly attracts people of Jewish ethnicity or origin. And here it's an Islamophobic left, which is not tolerated by the system, because these people, they are classical left-wing Republicans, teachers, people who are attached to the value of education. So they revolt against Islam, because Islam for them threatens the cherished value of neutral religiosity for the French state, namely that the French Republic ought to be, and has historically been, neutral since the end of the 19th century, and the state is not supposed to be involved in religious life. And these people, they are attached to the principle of separation of church and state, which is still valid, but they are very attached to this, and the principle that one ought not to talk about religion in the public sphere, and that's why they are opposed to radical Muslims and even to ordinary Muslims. And that's why they are leftist, but they are in the process of becoming far right, because they oppose an essential is the determination of das Wesens, identity and difference, for instance, of the system. So these people, they are classified by the system as far right people, although strictly speaking they are leftist. None of these people are white nationalists in a sense, but they are nonetheless far right, precisely because they are stable in a world ever switching towards the left. I mean, in a Western world switching toward the left, they are simply old-fashioned leftist. But if you remain a leftist in a political life which goes further and further towards the left with each passing decade, these people, they were leftist in the 1960s and 70s, and they have remained leftist, mainly the ideal of the working class, elevation through hard work. They are almost American. They are not Americans because they are all proto-communist or proto-socialist, but the ideal of the idea that if people work hard in school, they can make it. The idea that the state is a noble idea. It elevates the people to citizenship and civic virtue. So they are reactionary socialists, but they do not talk about the question of race, because this is not their software, but this is yeah. And here again we find the same contradiction. So here the theatrical far left, Islamophobes and Islamophiles, and here the same contradiction reappears, namely on the far left of the system, which is actually the far right. That's very Hegelian. These people are Islamophobic, and here people like Alain Soral is Islamophile, and his view consists in uniting the French working class and eventually the Catholics with the ordinary Muslim against what he calls the elites and that which he identifies with the Jews, basically. So he wants to resurrect anti-Semitism with no reference to racial identity. So he's an anti-racist, anti-Semite whose purpose is to attempt to unite Muslims with Catholics and with the white working class against the elites of the system, basically. I simplify. And that's why there are conflicts within the left, because someone like Dieudonné, he threatened, or at least the system pretended that he threatened their values. So there was a conflict between the former Prime Minister of Hollande, Mr. Valls, with Dieudonné, because he made jokes about Israel, basically. So although he's a mixed-race person who defends anti-racist views, even so sometimes pro-African views, he's a leftist, but he's considered a far-right ideologue, although he's a comedian. That's why it's quite complex. So only a native French person can understand the life of the French nation. So here we have the classical figure of civic nationalism in France, Ernest Renan. Nationalism in France was an invention of the left during the French Revolution, and here it's at the end of the 19th century with the rise of nationalism throughout Europe, in Italy, Germany, etc. France developed its own brand of nationalism, namely civic nationalism, not racial nationalism, as opposed to the Germanic view. And so here we have one of the founders of patriotism, and here civic patriotism or civic nationalism, namely the idea that members of a national community are united by bonds of or ties of spirit and not of blood. And that's why he's a leftist. And here we have serious communists, people who have read Hegel and who understand Hegel, and these people are very intelligent, and they are like them in a way. They are, here we have reactionary socialists, and here we have not reactionary communists. We have actually communists, because communism, the purpose of communism is to implement a communist society which is beyond left and right. So these people, they are very smart because they have read Hegel. That's why I have a lot of intellectual respect for these people. I'm not sure that this person read Hegel, but all the others, they are Hegelians, and they have influenced me greatly in my intellectual development. Wherever it has led me or will lead me, I have been influenced by these people. They taught me about Hegel when I was completely ignorant of many topics. So I owe a lot of my intellectual development to these people. They introduced me to Hegel, basically, and they are, on an intellectual level, they are smart. They are communists, but they are smart. Here we have traditional French anarchists, Proudhon, Louise Michel, Jacques Ellul, situationists. So the situationists here, there are the clowns situationists and the real situationists. These people were very smart. Here, Chaim Semprun, he was some sort of a, I could say he was he was not a communist, he was a radical critique of modernity. He was a very smart, because in the 1950s and 60s there were very smart people that we should call communists for lack of a better classification, but they were communists who understood that the USSR was a betrayal of communism, so they were anti-communist communists. They were communists who, because of their loyalty to the idea of communism, opposed really existing socialism, which is communism in the USSR, and they denounced, I mean, not these people because maybe they were too young, but there were intelligent communists in the 1950s and 60s and 70s who had the clarity of mind and the courage to denounce the crimes of the really existing socialist regime, and who remained faithful to the idea of communism, which is a noble idea, which has produced some dramatic and horrendous results. But the ideal, when it is seriously considered, is the ideal of Plato, basically, and of Marx in the noble sense. So here these are some sort of noble, anti-communist, radical critiques. So they have the courage and the clarity of mind to oppose modernity. And this person published in his publishing house, Kaczynski, for instance. Kaczynski was a terrorist and still is a terrorist, but he's an anti-modern. So these are a very specific branch of they are not really leftist. They are, it's difficult to classify them, but they are very intelligent. And here we have serious ecologists who also are in league with the far right because they are serious, basically. That's why most of these people, the theatrical people here, they are not really serious. And the people who are rejected by the system, they are rejected precisely because intellectually they are very serious. I mean, here is dubious, but these people intellectually they are serious, and these people as well, they from an intellectual level, it's high quality. Quality is quantity, so it's quantity because they have profound insights, extended views, a high faculty of uniting several numerically distinct concepts, etc. So concepts in the ordinary sense. So that's why they are highly quantitatively and highly qualitatively determined thinkers. So the people in this column, with the exception of maybe these people, I do not criticize them, but most of these people, the people in this category, they are really intelligent. It cannot be denied. And here we have people who are not really leftist, but they are kind of within the system without being in it because they are interested in science, and the system does not promote science only when it can advance its ideological purpose. But here these are just scientists, so philosophers, Hegelians, scientists. Here we have a physicist, a mathematician, and he's an ecologist not in a political sense, but in a theoretical sense. He's a thinker of ecology, so he probably has a background in physics as well, or And here we have people who wrote books about cosmic consciousness. And here are the spirits of death, some very important figure of the left. So these people, I don't know their political affiliation, and really it's not important, but they are within the system because they do not oppose the system in any way, but they do not, they are neither within or without. They are simply people who think. They are thinkers, basically. And he's an important French physicist, an important French mathematician who got involved into politics, but it was kind of a failure. But from a mathematical standpoint, he's very intelligent. Here he wrote great books about Hegel. And he's a great Hegelian scholar. So France produces quality in terms of intellect. And here we have these people. They are on the left, most of them. We have the scientists cannot. No, the scientists, they are not on the left. Scientists are not on the, because science precisely is beyond political divide. So these people are not leftist, but they are. They could be considered heroes of the left because, or I don't know, because Lavoisier was he had his head cut off by the French revolutionaries, but they represent the ideal of what the French Republic ought to be, or was ideally in the 19th century, namely an ideal which promotes science. But precisely Lavoisier was had his head cut off by the Republican revolutionary because they said the Republic doesn't need scientists. It's also contradictory. But these are just simply great French scientists. Pasteur, Marie Curie, and Lavoisier, these are really great scientists. Political figures here, they are mostly on the left. French feminists during the Revolution, Robespierre, who was in power during 1793 when the French Revolution got a little bit out of control and the heads started to fall. So he was in a very difficult situation. He's an ambiguous figure because he's kind of despised by the politically correct people because of his radical views, but he's kind of respected by the radical left and some communists, and most communists, and also by the right because he was kind of the founding father of a form of civic patriotism in a sense of civic duty, devotion to the fatherland. He was a virtue. He promoted virtue in politics. So he was a leftist, and even an extreme leftist within the context of the French Revolution. But because the historical process is in constant flux, nowadays he would be considered a far-right nationalist. he did not talk about race, but in the context of modernity, if Robespierre came back to life, he would be on the far right. And there are people on the far right who admire Robespierre. Jules Ferry, one of the founding fathers of the French educational system in the 19th century and the ideology of French free and compulsory education, also of colonialism. So here the leftists in the 19th century, they were colonialists, and the right wing of the 19th century, who were religious reactionaries, they were mostly opposed to colonialism. So it's a little bit like the Democrats and the Republicans on the question of slavery in the US. The colonialists were leftists, and the left, they control the educational system, and they make sure that the people forget, because if the people knew, I mean, most people know, but if everyone knew that the colonialism was an invention of the left, I mean, I simplified, there were right-wingers, businessmen who were interested, and there were left-wingers who were opposed in the name of universal brotherhood of the workers or whatever, but the leftist elites of the 19th century, they wanted to conquer Africa, and the leftist elite of today, well, they want the opposite, basically. They wanted France to conquer Africa, and in a Hegelian reversal, the modern elites want basically the opposite. I don't need to go into further detail. Here are all the presidents since de Gaulle. They were right-wingers from an economic standpoint, but their values were leftist. So Chirac was a right-winger politically, but he's actually a leftist. He pretended to be a right-winger, but he was a leftist. Yeah. Here we have classical, serious left-wing intellectual historians, and that's what I said. Only a native person, not anthropologically but culturally of a country, can know, because these nouns are completely unintelligible to someone who is not French. But it's just to illustrate that I will show the right-wing perspective. Here we have historians of the right, but only a culturally native person can know which historian is native to a country and which which native historian is on which side of the political divide. So every educated Frenchman knows broadly some of the most important historians of French history, because history is not finite, it's not a fixed determination, it evolves, it changes with each new generation. Each generation rewrites history, not in the Orwellian sense, but reinterpret history with the new data of the modern sciences, and retells its own history. And here are the names of some great left-wing, I mean, ideally they would think of themselves as being beyond right and left, because a historian ought to seek to be a scientist, but he was a communist. But educated Frenchmen know about the history of France, namely historiography, the way French history is being written, and only a culturally native person can know about these subtleties. Here we have intellectuals. Intellectual is probably a French invention, namely it's a smart person who makes a living by influencing others while spreading ideas. It was born in the 18th century, probably, and they are mainstream public opinion influencers. Here are classical French Hegelians, and here are French writers. I classify them on the left because they are more appreciated by the left, usually. He was a leftist within the context of 18th century France, namely he was a liberal in an aristocratic society, so he was on the left, but there were no left and right divide prior to, I mean, the conscious political divide prior to the French Revolution, simply because there was no political debates. It was an I mean, there were, but they were not determined by the rules of politics. It was inner conflicts between the aristocracy, the clergy, the king, etc. There were probably discussions and councils, etc. But it was not one man, one vote, basically. So he was a leftist in the context of 18th century aristocratic France. Same, he was a leftist. He was a bourgeois leftist. So he was the equivalent. Today, Flaubert, which is a fantastic, not fantastic in the sense of literary genre, but great. He is a great French writer, but in the modern context, he would be a cosmopolitan. But He was a bourgeois leftist of the day. Welbeck, he's a leftist, but he's cynical, so he's classified as a far right. But yeah, he's kind of cynical, but yeah. Victor Hugo is a leftist, radical leftist, difficult to classify. Communist, he was a ministry, he had an important role in the Ministry of Culture under de Gaulle after the Second World War. Early 18th century, Molière is not a leftist, but he made fun of the religious people, he made fun of the bourgeoisie, he got in trouble with important people of his day because his sense of humor was not liked and enjoyed by everyone, but he is a great writer, and he wrote some very profound plays, mostly the Misanthrope, which fascinated Rousseau. I think Rousseau is on the right, but whatever. Yeah. So yeah, I put it on the left because he's taught by the system, but he's beyond left and right. He's a national treasure, one might say. Montaigne, who was a skeptic. Rabelais, this is during the Renaissance, promoting knowledge. Greek and Latin, the humanities, a distanciation towards the authority of the church, etc. In a way. The author of Cyrano de Bergerac, who was one of the most brilliant plays in French literature. It's fantastic, actually. It's wonderful. It's worth speaking French just for having the privilege of reading Cyrano in the native French language, because it's really high literature. It's loved by most people because it's really a great story. Sade, which gave sadistic, he was a leftist. He was a radical left-wing Republican revolutionary. So sadism, historically, is an invention of the left, one might say. Voltaire, today, Voltaire, here you have people who are loyal to Voltaire. Today, Voltaire would be on the right, and even, because Voltaire was kind of a troublemaker of his days. They bring a lot of trouble, these French intellectuals, don't they? Thank God I do not identify as a French intellectual, but as a German metaphysician. But German metaphysics include pretty much everything in itself, so Voltaire was the Nietzsche of the 18th century. Nietzsche had a stronger character, but Voltaire was more subtle, more... Voltaire is the French Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is the German Voltaire, and their identity is the identity of Germany and France, and their difference is the difference between Germany and France. And since identity and difference are identical, but nonetheless differentiated, Voltaire and Nietzsche are a Hegelian couple. Nietzsche would love this joke, because Nietzsche, to be honest, Nietzsche in his best moment is really great. And yeah, and here Zola denounced the oppression of the working class, so he was a radical left-wing. So most of them, if not all of them, they really are leftist politically. Good literature, it is said in France, good literature is right-wing literature. But here, they are almost all of them are leftist, with the exception of Molière, who is beyond left and right, but they are leaning on the left. But there are really great writers here, but I think the writers on the right, if we are honest, they are better. Racine, Corneille, Balzac, Stendhal, and I put Rousseau on the right, which if the French, and I think they will at some point watch this, putting Rousseau as a right-wing author is a very dubious choice. People might disagree with a lot of things I say, but maybe this is one of the biggest point of contention, of disagreement, namely why did I put Rousseau as a right-wing author? Because I'm well aware that Rousseau was the father of Romanticism and was left-leaning, but Rousseau cannot be classified. He's beyond left and right. He's simply he cannot be classified. He's too great to be boxed in, basically. But I understand that people might want to put Rousseau on the left, but actually the great leftist figures of history, if they came back to life, they would be far right. Robespierre would be far right. Jean Jaurès would be a reactionary socialist. Simone Weil, these people, they are Hegelian, so they would switch from left to right. But these people, they would be on the right, most of them, basically. Okay, so that was in 1 hour, broadly, more than 1 hour, the view of, and here also a radical left-wingers political figure. So Marat was a French revolutionary during the times of Robespierre. He was even more radical. He was assassinated by Charlotte Corday, so he was really a radical leftist thing. Robespierre was extreme left, but with a sense of the common good. Here he was extreme left with really negative views. I do not judge him, but simply to say that Robespierre was very radical, but he was more encompassing of the whole nation, whereas Marat was really it was a class warfare before the communists of the 19th and 20th century. Blanqui was, I think, some sort of an anarchist. Boulanger. Boulanger was a far-right populist of the 19th century. I put him on the left because he was a populist, but he was on the far right. He attempted, or could have attempted, a coup to seize power, but it failed. Hébert was a revolutionary. Babeuf was a proto-communist in 1796, so many years after the beginning of the Robespierre. It's 1793. Babeuf, it's 1906. He attempted the conspiracy of the equal, so he really was a communist. So Robespierre was some sort of a civic patriot or a civic nationalist, and here these are proto Marat, Hébert, Babeuf. These are proto-communists. That's why Babeuf is admired by the communists. Vallès was some sort of a radical anarcho left-wing communist of the end of the the second half of the 19th century. And Louise Michel participated, she's also here, in the Commune, which is an attempt to establish a working class, self-organizing, autonomous community in Paris in 1971, if I'm not mistaken, 70 or 71, when the Second Empire by Napoleon III entered a war with Prussia, and Bismarck defeated the French and united the German Reich, the Second German Reich. Yeah. Okay, so this is broadly the view of, this is what I could say about French political life on the left, and the left actually is the whole system. So the system includes what is within the frame of the system, the far left and the far right. That's why Marine Le Pen is on the far right of the system, but the system is on the left of a conceptual divide, one might say. And now I will just make a pause, and I will make a brief few more comments. Okay, I will just make a few more comments on the left side. Yeah, so brief comments that I think I did not mention. The anti-racist woke left. It's very unusual because these people, they talk about race. They try to import the woke ideology or the cancel culture in France, but I talked about this, but I repeat, it's very important. It's within the French context because the notion of race is not usual in France, so they are kind of problematic because if they import racial debates in France, where it's not historically, I mean, there has been the debate about race in France historically, but it's not as prevalent as in America, for instance, or Canada, or countries where whites have been in contact with non-whites for centuries. So it's not common in France, so that's why these people, they bring about the race ideology, the anti-racist ideology, but anti-racism implies within its concept racism, because the opposites are united. So by importing racial ideology, even if it's for the sake of anti-racism in the modern system, they disrupt in a way the stability of the system, basically. But they are nonetheless tolerated because they are anti-racist and they want to bring more guilt for whites. But precisely, they want to introduce even more white guilt because the system is, I would use the terminology of Hegel, is an sich anti-white in terms of promoting guilt, but it promotes guilt to people who are not supposed to know that they are white. And they are real anti-racist in the sense that they bring about the Sein für Anders, namely the consciousness for whites that there are racial conflicts the French are not supposed to know that, because the ideology of the system is that race does not exist. It has no ground, no scientific ground. Okay, so also another remark: the conservative left. These people, they criticize the negative effects of multiculturalism, but not descendants of immigrants. They criticize multiculturalism from a leftist perspective because it hampers, disrupts the life of the working class, but with no mention of race or ethnicity. So they are they criticize multiculturalism, but not. So they criticize the universality without criticizing the singularization. They criticize multiculturalism without criticizing the singulars who embody different cultures, namely without criticizing the immigrants. They are honest in a sense, but they're also in a state of contradiction, because you cannot have, if you have problems with multiculturalism, it's because there are various singular individuals in conflict with one another, which is being made manifest through crime, insults, a feeling of insecurity, etc., etc. The sovereignty. People whose struggle is against the loss of sovereignty by the EU, etc. In every country, in the public debate, there is a symbolic date, depending where you are, on the left or on the right, there is a symbolic date of the fall. That's a very Christian story that one finds in every country. Things were good, and then an event occurred. Things were good, but then an event occurred which brought about the fall. And for these people, the pro-sovereignty leftists, the fall was the Maastricht Treaty, I think in 1992, when freedom of circulation and exchange, etc., within the European boundaries of the European community in terms of political entity became a manifest. So for them, the reactionary socialist or the reactionary left, the fall occurred with Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty, with Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberal policies. These people, the half-serious communists who haven't read Hegel, the fall for them was basically neoliberalism, Thatcher and Reagan. For them, it's Maastricht, or 2007 when Sarkozy, who is a member of the cosmopolitan elite, he's a globalist in a sense. When there was a referendum in 2005 whether or not France should vote to adopt a European constitution, they need to politically unify Europe and the EU, and the French said no, and then in 2007 Sarkozy implemented a text which kind of forced France to adopt an aspect of constitutional subordination, nonetheless. So these people, they are in the idea that it was 2007 and Sarkozy who fucked us, or 1992 and Maastricht, or Thatcher and Reagan. That's why everyone is anti-American, anti-American because they associate America with multicultural conflicts. Anti-American because they associate America with neoliberalism. They associate America with the loss of the defeat of the most radical communists here. They say, okay, basically they are sometimes they are nostalgic of Soviet Russia, basically. So yeah, but that's just a broad picture of the left wing view. And now I will talk about the right wing. So what is outside of the system? Here are the right-wing perspective. So I use the word scarecrow, namely it's supposed to frighten people. So these people in this column, up until outside, so all these people, basically, most of them, they are scarecrow right-wingers, namely they are partly tolerated by the system, because they are a reassuring threat, in a sense that the system needs an opponent to show to the masses of the people the masses of people would be here maybe. Beware, because look at how frightening they are. I will just briefly explain. These people, they want to implement free market economy. They will lower the taxes. There will be less public education, less public infrastructure. You don't want that to happen, do you? That's basically what the system says to the average French person. So there are the free market scarecrows. This can only be understood within the context of France, because free market is a frightening ideology for the French, whereas in America, this would be a socialism. So that's a difference between America and France, or America or France and even England, or any free market country. Here, the scarecrow far right, the scarecrow Islamophobes. So here are Islamo-skeptics who are tolerated, Islamophobes who are tolerated, but here they are considered as a threat because they are conservative. Here they are far leftists, and here they are leftists, but here they are right-wing conservative, moderate conservative Islamophobes. So there are various brands of Islamophobia and Islamophilia as well. So yeah, here you have the scarecrow neo-Nazis, generation identity. They are Piketty accused generation identity of being neo-Nazis, basically. Right-wing newspapers and some philosophers who are more or less right-wingers. Okay. And here you have, and here it's a universal, people who are outside of the system, Nancy, outside of the political media circus, and who develop their ideas on the internet. So here, these are westernized descendants of immigrants. So some of their parents or grandparents probably came from Northern African or Asian countries, and they may even be Muslim, but these people have fully assimilated. They have become Westerner in a sense of objective ergoism, namely the values, characteristics, behaviors, ways of life of the West, and they are attached emotionally, intellectually, culturally to the West, which they know from the French perspective. So these people, they are Western patriots, one might say. And I know that this exists in every Western country, because there are descendants of immigrants who fail to integrate socially, and those who succeed, and most of them succeed, but there are those who are in the middle, but a proportion of them fail and turns to a radical Islam. A proportion of them, here it's probably sociologically determined, those who are working class, they remain attached to the Muslim tradition because they find appeasement in religion. Those who fail, they become lumpen proletariat, namely the underclass, criminals of all sorts, dealing drugs, raping, or becoming welfare addicts, etc. And radical Islam attracts desocialized immigrants and intelligent people who go there for spiritual reasons, whatever. But and also, so here would be the ordinary Muslims who remain strongly attached to the Muslim religion would be mostly working class people, and here not only but mostly also middle class, but mostly middle and working class. And here these are people who are usually very well assimilated to the Western life, and most of the time, if their parents were Muslims, they have given up on the Muslim religion, and this person, for instance, is an anti-Muslim thinker in a way, and they found freedom as promoted by the good left, freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of freedom for women, from sometimes the dominating aspect of Muslim patriarchy in some Northern African or African countries. So these people, they love the West, and they are attached to Western values, but because the system is trying to dismantle the West, these people, they kind of contradict the system, because they are descendants of immigrants who become attached to Western civilization. So they are in the subconscious of some of these people. They are considered to be traitors. They probably think in these spheres, you are traitors. You are not supposed to join them, or whatever. So these people, they are in a difficult position psychologically, because they are considered. Maybe some of them, some of the desocialized consider them as traitors. Some of radical Muslims consider them as traitors. anti-colonialists, they consider them as traitors, and even the left, here it's a common feature in every Western country, modern Western country, namely the leftists, they claim to be anti-racist and to love everyone except whites, basically, but actually they don't, because they don't like non-whites who succeed economically and intellectually. There are factions of the woke left who genuinely despises non-whites who succeed, because if the non-whites become independent, they become independent from the woke ideology, which is a way of manipulating immigrants and the white working class as well, and to gain social status and domination in the political game. So I know that in America or Canada there are liberal Democrats, white liberals, who despise Asians because Asians are proportionately successful, not all of them, but there's a significant proportion of Northeast Asians who are successful in Canada or America or any Western countries, and it ruins the narrative of saying that immigrants are desocialized sometimes because they are oppressed by the patriarchy or the racist society or whatever. So it ruins the narrative because it proves empirically that people of all origins can succeed in a system if the rules are not completely rigged. So it ruins the narrative, which consists in saying that the system is racist against non-whites, systemic racism. We do not have the expression systemic racism in France except in the woke circles, but these people, they are the French equivalent of the successful blacks, successful Hispanics, and successful Asians of the US. Namely, they ruin the narrative of the white leftists because they succeed. And then the white leftists say, God damn it, our manipulation and our scheming is being ruined. Sometimes the white race is genuinely comical. Because here in the anti-racist woke left, there are only whites. It's a typically white ideology. In the cosmopolitan elites, there are people of various ethnicities, mostly white, but also you know who's, as they call this. And here in the woke, there are only, this is a typically left white ideology. So yeah, these non-whites, they annoy. And this is not a joke about Hanoi, the city in Vietnam, because there are successful Vietnamese here. So it's not Hanoi as the city in Vietnam, but they annoy, like annoying the white leftists, basically, because they become independent from the intellectual dominance of the left. And I know that it's very frustrating for whites in America as well when blacks become successful, because successful blacks in America, they say, oh no, I don't want to vote for the Democrats, either I don't want to vote because I know that the political system is corrupt, or I vote for Republicans because they promote sounder economic policies, not always but most of the time. And it's very annoying for a white leftist to see that blacks and Hispanics become independent. So these people, in a way, they are in a very difficult situation because the entire system is against them because they are successful, basically. Yeah, and here you have, outside of the system on the internet, you have sovereignty, advocates of sovereignty, so they are in league, more or less, with these people in a way. You have the leftists, so here they are conservative leftists, but they are, they cannot be easily classified. They are Gaullists from General de Gaulle, namely they are a unity of left and right. That's why they are very intelligent. I'm not sure that he belongs here, but I didn't know where to classify. But the Aristotelian circle, the Cercle Aristote and Pierre-Yves Rougeron, they are very intelligent because they try to balance the political conflict. So they are modern representative of de Gaulle ideology. Namely, de Gaulle was a right-winger, but with a leftist heart, in a way. He had a right-wing mindset with a leftist heart, and that's why he was a great statesman. Maybe the last great statesman that France had. And these people are faithful to de Gaulle. So yeah, all the people, I will just illustrate to make things intelligible. The classification on the right. For these people, the hero of the Second World War is de Gaulle. For these people, it is Pétain, who was the ruler of the French state, which was a state under partly Nazi dominated France. So it was it partly was partly independent, but it aligned itself with Nazi Germany. It had been defeated. It tried to restore a traditionalist order, but there was the Nazi occupation of a part of France. There was the pressure from the resistance, from the Allies, so it was difficult. So the hero of the Second World War for the reactionary Catholics, most of them, is Philippe Pétain. For them, it's de Gaulle, and Pétain is kind of the evil figure in French political life. It's even worse than Hitler. Hitler, of course, is evil, but Pétain is worse because he's French. So in the system, Hitler is really evil, but he's a German, so the French expect the German, or he was an Austrian, they expect the German to be evil, although they keep promoting peace and friendship with Germany, but in the collective French psyche, the Germans are evil, but the real evil of modern life in France, the figure around which everyone revolves, is Pétain, because he's the one who collaborated with the Nazis, so he's the associate of Hitler, which is even worse than being Hitler in a way, from the French perspective. So for some of the reactionary Catholics, the hero of the Second World War is Pétain, and for the far right fringes of the far right, the hero is Hitler. So by classifying who is the hero of the Second World War, you understand the political affiliation of the person. And on the left, officially the hero here is de Gaulle. Here it's de Gaulle as well, and here in the fringes of there are people who say maybe it was Stalin, basically. Or here the hero is Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle. And for them, partly Stalin, because they understand that it is because of the threat of communism that the French workers had access to higher standards of living, because the capitalist elites in the communist narrative, the capitalist elite after the end of Second World War, they felt the threat of the USSR, so they were forced to concede material and political and social advantages to the working class, which would not have been made possible if there hadn't been a balance of power between the West and the USSR. So here it's Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, but the problem here, I will talk about de Gaulle, the problem for the system is that de Gaulle was a right-winger, although he was in league with the communists for historical reasons, because the communists had helped starting in 1941 onward to defeat the National Socialist occupants. But de Gaulle, he was a man of the 19th century. He was born in the 19th century, and he still had, he's kind of, in the sense, he's kind of Churchill in the sense that he's the official hero, but he has some embarrassing aspects within the context of modernity. Namely, de Gaulle is famous for having said that France is, first and foremost, a white country of a white race country of Christian religion and Greek and Roman culture. So he defined France as anthropologically white, culturally Greek and Latin, and religiously Christian, which is a problem for the cosmopolitan elites. That's why de Gaulle has become an embarrassment for the people who want to integrate the system, because to try to just to remind the people that France up until the 1960s was a white Christian Greco-Roman country is a problem for the system. That's why de Gaulle has become an ambiguous figure, simply because he just said what had been true for thousands of years, namely that France had been white for thousands of years, had been Catholic since the 5th century, and Greek and Roman since Roman since Julius Caesar in the 1st century BCE, and Greek even further in time with the Greek merchants of the south of France. So yeah, that's why he's an ambiguous figure, although he's the official hero. So yeah, I will just make a pause. Okay, so I just took a 2 minutes pause. I continue. I just would like to say that I already said this at the beginning of the video, but now I will use this small pause to remind us that what I say about the French intellectual and spiritual life, contemporary and historical, but I haven't spent much time classifying the historical figures. I did this in a few minutes, a few dozens of minutes. I didn't. It's not a scholarly lecture, because there are many, of course, there are many historical figures missing, many inventors. I just had classified them from a few books or a few dictionaries that I picked, but it's not rigorous and serious. It has to be changed. It's not. It's not. It's just. That's what I said in some of my previous video. I will not try to be a perfect scholar. I will share step by step all my documents, even though they are unfinished. But what I want to say is that I speak as an empirical Frenchman in terms of culture, upbringing, and geographical location, but I rely upon, I mean, I don't expect, but I guess that people who will watch this video eventually, whatever their country is, first, mostly Western people, because the classification, the categories are only intelligible within the context of modern Western world. But actually, it's true for every country which has a set of institutions and a flourishing intellectual life that oppositions can be classified. And what I want to say is that the viewers which are not empirically French, they have to abstract. Here I will make a small pause and show my diagram again. Okay, this is the diagram that I showed earlier, but I just remind in case it's not clear that here I speak as a singular country with the particularity of being a European country, a Western country, a socialist country, and many other particularities, but what I say can help enlighten most inhabitants of other European countries, and by European countries I mean countries which have been historically populated by Europeans. It's not a complete list here neither, but historical European countries and Western countries as well, while knowing that there are particularities in common, and those who are peculiar or particular or specific. These are various terminology, various words to express the same logical determination, namely there are particulars which are universal to all particulars of the same particularity. I hope that you follow me. And there are particulars which are particular to France, and therefore they are singular. For instance, the relation, the economic aspect of French intellectual life is specific to France. Maybe it can be understood by Italians or Spaniards partly, because they also have a kind of a Marxist tradition, because in case it wasn't clear, France has a strong Marxist history. Most people, maybe I should have emphasized this, but most people in France are Marxists, on the right and on the left. Marx is a, how do you call this? Figure tutélaire. I don't know how you call this. A prominent figure in the intellectual life. Whether you are a right-winger or a left-winger, all the shades of leftism and of right-wing, you have to be a Marxist at some moment if you want to be serious in the French intellectual climate, which makes French a particular country in the sense that it's very different from the US. The right-wing, the conservative in France, they are Marxists, basically. They reason in terms of class struggle. It's way too simple to reduce Marx to class struggle, but they have the categories of Marxism, whether consciously or unconsciously, implemented in their mind because of the historical geist of the country, the educational system, the history, the traditions, etc., etc., the life of the working class throughout the past couple of centuries in France, the peasant revolts even before modernity, the Middle Ages, etc. There is a strong tradition of popular uprising against the bourgeois or aristocratic decadent elites. So in this sense, French is specific, namely it has a particularity of its own that maybe it shares partly with Italians and Spaniards, who also have a strong influence by Marxism, and also every European country has been influenced over the past 150 years by Marxism, but it could be compared with Italy, but then Italy is different on so many other determinations that to compare France and Italy under certain Bestimmtheiten, it's relevant, and to others it's not, in the sense that the Italians, they do not have the same question around demographics. I mean, there are demographic problems in Italy, but it's not as widespread as in France in terms of the impact upon the intellectual life, so to speak. So, in a sense, France is a singular country in the sense that it is different from strictly purely Nordic. So here are purely Nordic in terms of historical anthropological determination, almost purely Nordic countries. Here it's partly Nordic, partly not Nordic. Yeah, France has specificities, which means particularity in common with Western countries, European countries, socialist countries, French-speaking countries, etc., etc. And then, like I said, empirically, I'm a Frenchman, and I cannot think like a native American, not a native Indian, anthropologically, a native cultural American, or a native cultural Englishman, or a native cultural Vietnamese. But I speak here in English, which is the universal language of mankind, for better and for worse. But right now, I can, at this moment in time, when I'm recording this video, I can only understand, given my current state of knowledge, mostly Western countries and European countries, because the limitation of language. Because I can only speak French, English, and partly German on an empirical level. But anyway, so the other particulars watching this video eventually will have to abstract and to abstract from the singular case of France that which only belongs to the singular country of France, and to see the particularities which can be applied to other countries, and to use their knowledge of the singular determinations of their, let us say it is France, it is Canada, or it is France, it is Sweden. The singulars mutually exclude one another, in the sense that the determinations of France are unique to France, so are those of Canada, Sweden, the US, Germany, whatever, but they share certain particularities in common. France and Sweden are Western countries. France and Canada, they have a native speaking French population. France and the US, they had an important revolution in the 18th century. France and England, oy vey, don't start with English. There's a long story of reciprocal friendship, manly friendship, one might say, between the French and the English. But I don't identify as a Frenchman, I identify as a German. So, but there's also a long history of struggle between the French, the English, the German. Well, go back to the commentary. Okay, so I continue my commentary. So I spoke broadly about the broad outlines of what I call the scarecrow right, namely the right who is there to threaten the ordinary people, but they are nonetheless, these people, they appear within the system in order to threaten or to scare the population, basically. But they are part of the system in a way, more or less. So here you have the example of a philosopher, an anti-Hegelian philosopher. But if you are anti-Hegelian, you are confirming Hegel, basically. So he started as a leftist influenced by the May 68 ideology. So he started as a radical leftist, an hedonistic, materialist leftist. So he was, up until a few years ago, he was promoted by the system because he promotes hedonism, materialism, atheism, etc. So he's a hedonistic leftist. But he's also, here his personal story, which he wrote in his bio, is interesting because he's kind of with these people. I mean, he began as a hedonistic, materialist, atheist leftist, but he has an aspect of reactionary socialist in him, and he comes from a poor, working class, native French family, and he has some sort of a loyalty unconscious to his father and to the country of his childhood. I think he probably born in the 1950s or 60s, I don't know. And this is a typical phenomenon which can be witnessed throughout the Western world, namely these old white men who have been either leftist or moderate right-wingers throughout their life, and they are starting to see that the world of their youth, which was almost entirely white, I think like someone like Charles Murray. Charles Murray cannot be compared with Michel Onfray, because Charles Murray would be he, in the context of France, Charles Murray would be a far-right bourgeoisie. So Charles Murray, who is a respectable, moderate libertarian in America, would be a far-right extremist in France. That's just to explain, to illustrate. But he has the story of Charles Murray, the political scientist who wrote the bell curve in the US. They have in common the fact that they are nostalgic of the country of their childhood, where unconsciously everyone was white. It's not that they are racist. They are not racist, but they are attached to the ideal the ideal place of their birth, basically where their childhood or their teenage year, where society was kind of difficult. I don't know the story of Charles Murray, and that's not really important, but for his parents and for himself, childhood was difficult, but France was still rural, still traditional in the 1950s and 60s. It had not yet embarked upon modernity, whereas the Americas had in the 1920s. France, it was a little later. So he's nostalgic of the country in which he grew up, and he sees that it is becoming under the threat of becoming extinct, that the France of his younger years will disappear if nothing is done. That's why he switched from far left hedonism to reactionary, conservative socialism in a way. So he's still a leftist, but his loyalty to stability in a way has moved him towards the right in a way. Yeah. Here you have conservatives who dare talk about civilizational issues. They do not talk about ethnicity, but they talk about civilization and culture. Whereas the conservatives, the majority of the conservatives, they are within the system and they are tolerated by the system because they only talk about business and economics and hypocritical values. But here, these conservatives, some of them, they talk about the threat to French culture, French civilization, which is a hot topic because the system tries to erase French culture and the French people as well. Here you have the scarecrow free market economist. It can only be understood within the context of France, namely the history of Marxism and socialism and Keynesian policies and state interventionism throughout French history makes it so that France is one of the most heavily taxed, heavily regulated country on the planet. The ratio of public expenses to GDP is one of the highest in the world. The welfare state is one of the largest. The healthcare system, that's why France is considered to be a heaven or a paradise for many people, because it seems to be a socialism which has succeeded. And these people, they are used by the system as scarecrows, saying these people, they only talk about economics. I mean, he talks about intellectual life, and he too, but these people, they only talk about economics, and when they are invited in the political media circus, it's to say, beware, there is a lot of debt, we will have to lower the taxes for the rich, we will have to deregulate the economy. And the average French person, they are very afraid of the free market because they have been told that it's very evil, very nasty when the workers, the entrepreneurs can enjoy the benefits of their labor. It's exploitation. Because here, that's the truth. For an American, someone who receives money from the state, I simplify, but basically is a parasite, and he's an exploiter. So from the American perspective, the classical American perspective, someone who receives money from the state, a welfare recipient, is an exploiter of the state and of the people who finances the state, namely the taxpayer. In France, it's the opposite. In France, if you are a businessman, if you start a business, if you are your own boss, you are an exploiter because of the Marxist narrative that bosses and self-owned businesses are exploitative. It's a caricature of Marxism. Of course, Marx didn't think like that, but the system over the past the couple of centuries, or the past 150 years, has distorted Marx, and the most caricatural the most caricatural form of leftism. Basically, they say that if you own your business, you are an exploiter, and if you are a welfare recipient, you deserve that because you are a victim of oppression. So, in America, there is systemic racism. In France, there is a systemic capitalist oppression. Although France is a socialist country, that's why there are so many misunderstandings, because everyone almost in France complains about neoliberalism and its destructive impact upon the French economic life, but France is one of the most socialist and even proto-communist countries in the world. And these people, they are the typical conservative free market person who only care about economics, but at least they are clear-minded in the sense that these are some of the only people who see that France is not a neoliberal jungle, but it's actually a socialist state, and this is threatening for the ordinary consciousness, because the mind of the people has been distorted by distorted economic views. So here it's typical of French life in a sense that, like I said, what is considered here. Let us take only the economic Bestimmtheit, the economic determinacy. The moderate Republican in America would be considered far right economically in France, and the far right, the economic far right, these would be here what I call libertarian. They would be average Republicans in America, for instance. So there's here a strong difference between France and America, and it can be extended to continental Europe and Anglo-Saxon countries, namely that continental Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and even Belgium, the Netherlands have a strong tradition of unions and workers' unions, whereas in America it's really a self-made man, American dream, etc., etc. Yeah, so here's one of the specificities of France, namely the idea that in one of the most socialist, proto-communist countries on earth, everyone believes that the French are a neoliberal jungle, basically. No, the state controls every aspect of the economic life, almost. Yeah. And here, for example, someone like Philippe Nemo, I wrote, he has become too smart to be tolerated by the system. So the system tolerates a left-wing opposition and a right-wing opposition, which is used as a scarecrow to frighten the people. But Philippe Nemo, he's what could be called a classical liberal, which means actually kind of a moderate libertarian. He could be classified here as well, but he's very intelligent. So he has become too smart for the system. So a few years ago, he was still invited in the media to talk about reducing taxes, deregulating, etc. But he's also an intellectual, and he's not just an economist. He has a philosophical background, and he's actually very smart. He's inspired by Hayek and Mises. And someone who has read Hayek and Mises within the context of French life is kind of a nuisance or even a threat because he's too clear-minded. That's why he's been excluded. And here, someday I know you will probably hear this in French or in English. You will find this very comical. He has become too smart, so he has been excluded from the system. You are too intelligent. You are revealing too much truth. Get out of here. I laugh now, but that's the truth. There are people who... Zemmour, it's the same. Zemmour is for a different reason. Nemo is a philosophical libertarian. It's not just an economic libertarian. He is a political and philosophical libertarian. Within the context of France, namely, you have to make compromises, so he's not an American libertarian, but he's as libertarian as you can get within the context of one of the most socialist countries on earth. And here you have someone like Zemmour. Here, the same. Zemmour was invited by the system in the media, had been invited for many years, many decades. He was a prominent part of the entertainment industry at some point. But he started to criticize Islam, and he became a nuisance, a threat to the system, because he too is almost too intelligent. Actually, he's become too intelligent. So, in the political circus, the far right is Marine Le Pen, but actually Zemmour is on the far right, but Zemmour, he's a real right-winger. So in a sense, Marine Le Pen, she's a leftist, she has no culture, she enjoys dancing in nightclubs while listening to African music. Nothing wrong with that. African music can be great and entertaining, but she is considered to be far right by foreigners. Maybe it is said that Marine Le Pen is a far right opposition. No, she's a leftist. But as Eric Zemmour, he's not far right, but he's really a right winger. So he's maybe the only right winger within the system. That's why there's a contradiction, because the system is not supposed to tolerate right wingers. So Zemmour is one of the contradictions of the system. But in a case it hasn't been clear, the system is filled with contradictions at all levels. But I just show systematically, it's not very rigorous, but I show all the contradictions of the system. So here you have the scarecrow Islamophobes. Here is another someone who denounces radical Islam. Like I said, generation identity. They are the equivalent on the right of the theatrical far left. So I could have said theatrical neo-Nazi. There are theatrical means like in a show. It's like I said earlier in the video, it's a reference to Guy Debord, that la société du spectacle, but spectacle, it's not, it cannot be translated in English. It doesn't mean the same thing. It's spectacle mean the show business, basically like the Americans, their political the political life of America is a big circus. Every democratic system is a circus, but in America it's fully embraced. Like you have to produce entertainment if you want to be a successful American politician. In France, it's considered to be offensive, and that's why most of the recent French politicians have been dull and boring, because you are supposed to have a certain sense of restraint if you are a French politician. In America, if you want to be a successful politician, you have to be larger than life, to be over the top. Reagan, even JFK in a way, and Trump, of course, etc. So yeah. So what was it? Yeah. So generation identity is the counterpart of the circus far left. You have the circus far right and the circus far left, and they complement one another in a way. Then there are right-wing newspapers. These are conservative, economic conservatism, which actually means economic free market within the context of France. So they are still socialist, but they are free market socialist. And here you have conservative values in a way. Yeah. And then outside of the system, like I said, this is a new generation of not him, but most of them, they are descendants of immigrants of various origins. Africans, Asians, whatever, and they have become adapted to modern Western life. They have become successful. They are embodiment. I mean, not only these people, but there are many descendants of immigrants who have become Westernized, who are not famous, but they have become Westernized. And their problem is that, like I said earlier, they are rejected by a proportion of their ethnic kindred, in a way, by the system, for the reason that I mentioned earlier. Namely, the system doesn't want non-whites to succeed, because the official narrative is that what justifies the system is that systemic racism, the white people are oppressing the minorities. But if you show that there are successful minorities because maybe they are more intelligent or work harder or whatever, it becomes a problem. And also, one of the contradictions that I have not mentioned is that the system seeks to disrupt, to use the educational system to brainwash the population, but they are confronted with a contradiction, which is true in every Western country, namely the will to brainwash the native population, but at the same time to produce elites from immigrant backgrounds in order to become integrated within the system, and to produce economic elites to enable the system to reproduce itself. So the system has to incorporate immigrants and descendants of immigrants, the children of the white middle class, and these people usually they do not have children, but the children of the high white middle class. So they have to create an educational system which enables their sons and daughters to be successful. The sons and daughters of immigrants to be successful and to prevent the sons and daughters of the white working class from accessing power. So that's why they try to ruin the educational system. But and that's why it's a contradiction. They have to find a proper balance between dumbing down the population, turning the population into idiots, and also providing enough knowledge to keep producing scientists, not for the sake of knowledge, but at least social scientists, which might help manipulate the population, basically. So they need they need to dumb down the population while at the same time selecting sufficiently intelligent people to perpetuate the system. It's very well designed. I understand the process very well. But I know that most Westerners with clarity of mind, they agree that it's the same in every Western country. That this is one of the contradictions of the system. Namely, on the one side, the system tries to dumb down the population, to control them, to manipulate them, to exploit them. But at the same time, it needs to extract from the educational system a sufficient amount of people with real knowledge to be able to perpetuate the manipulation. So it's problematic. Yeah. Here, like I said, these are really serious thinkers in the good sense. They are moderate in the good sense, because they are the soft moderate and the hard moderate. And the hard moderate are those who are able to find stability, balance, measure in the good sense between opposed poles and to solve the problems. And these people, they are really serious. He does not really belong here. He's more. I will put him there. Yeah. Here you have libertarians. I wrote what I wrote. Yeah, I know what I wrote, but I just want to. Yeah, the libertarians, they are some sort of autists. They are autistic people because they understand everything from an economic standpoint, but they are completely isolated because no one cares about libertarians in France. So they are. This is autistic intelligence. Very intelligent people, but no one listens to them because the French are not culturally libertarian. So these people, they are kind of lost souls. They are not anthropologically Anglo-Saxon, but their mind is Anglo-Saxon, which means partly Jewish, partly English, partly American. Namely Mises, Rothbard, Ayn Rand, Hayek, Jean-Baptiste Say, and Frédéric Bastiat. I know they were Frenchmen, but the kind of readings that the Mises Institutes make, or Friedman, so they are American libertarians lost in a socialist country. I will not cut the laughing part because I am genuinely laughing because I feel I feel compassion for these people because they are simply too smart. Here I laugh, but actually I suffer. Because I know that there are people, Nemo, Zemmour, and these libertarians, they are genuinely smart, because here I will try to be serious, but I am genuinely serious. But France likes to think of itself as a recluded village threatened by the Roman invasion. That's the caricature of Asterix, the cartoon, the comics, the comic books, namely the small Gaulish village resisting against Roman invasion. That's one of the archetypes of the French psyche, which is partly dangerous because in Asterix comic books everyone is white and even blonde, and yeah, but that's another story. But there is this in the collective psyche of the native Frenchmen, I mean the descendants of the historical French population, the idea that the French descend from the Gauls, which is partly true, they were Celtic. Gaul is another word for Celt, basically. Partly Germanic through the invasion of the Franks and the Norman, etc., but also mostly Celtic. And in the collective psyche, there's this which is being made manifest in Asterix as some sort of a joke. But Asterix comic books, they are funny, of course, but they are very profound. And cultural Hegelianism consists in saying that pop culture, in all of its aspects, manifests deep truth. And Asterix is very funny for the young and the old, but it's also very profound, and it's a very good spiritual humor. And it reveals some truth, namely that the French like to think of themselves as being a struggling minority against the Roman invasion, and in the modern day, the Romans would be the Americans. For the far right, the invasion would be the demographic invasion, but for the intellectual, this would be the American invasion. And here it's the reverse, namely these people, they are like a minority struggling against an invasion of socialists, and they have in Asterix there is the super potion, the magical potion that you drink in order to acquire superpowers. And these people, they have read good books from the American libertarian tradition, which makes them super smart, and they are some sort of in a resistance against everyone else, because they are libertarians, but they are not anti-racist, they are non-racist. Namely, anti-racism means to be determined by racism and to talk about racism all the time. These people, they are simply not racist, because for them race is not a relevant question. They talk about economics and also political libertarianism in a way, and they are kind of isolated. No one understands them, but they understand most of everyone else. Because the left, they dislike them because they are pro-free market, and the intelligent right, they dislike them because they accuse them of being anti-patriotic, because libertarians, they are beyond national boundaries. They are a universal breed, one might say. A true libertarian has an empirical country, but he is universally connected with all the libertarians in a way. That's the international, how do you call this? L'international communist, there's the communist international, no, there's the libertarian international. So these people, they are like the Gauls resisting the Roman invasion of socialist ideas, basically. And the Catholics, I can talk about the Catholics now. The Catholics, they have developed a social policy, because in France, if you want to be accepted, you have to have a social policy. Everyone has a social policy. There is the welfare of the system. There is more welfare by the left. There is collectivism or collectivization by the far left, which becomes far right in a way. There is the socialist conservative. There are the socialism of the Catholics. There is the communism of some members of the white nationalist class. They are not social, but yeah. But in order to attract an audience, they have to talk sometimes about. They try not to, but yeah, these are the only people who are not interested in socialism, alongside with them. But they are far right because they talk about ethnicity, and they don't. But anyway, so the Catholics now. So here we have these people. They are the scarecrow right, namely they are made public by the system to threaten the people, to say, look, these evil people, they want to reduce taxes. Reducing taxes for the average Frenchman is an evil. For most people on the planet, this is considered good, but for the French, if you say lower taxes, means lower taxes for the rich. So in the collective archetype, it means that the rich will become richer, they will steal the money from the poor. Less taxes means less infrastructure, less healthcare, less education. So there's this schizophrenia in the collective French psyche. Most people complain about the educational system, but if someone said, let us privatize the educational system by reducing, let us reduce taxes, which means there will be less investment in the educational system, and the educational system will become more privatized, then people would complain, because they would complain about the risk of bringing inequalities. But the inherent structure of collectivized education brings about inequalities, namely only the richest and wealthiest kids of the bourgeoisie can afford to escape from the negative aspect of the educational system. So this is one of the many contradictions But anyway, so let us talk about the Catholics. Here you have old school Catholics, namely people who have remained Catholics throughout the past decade, because the death of Catholicism, symbolically, it's in the 1960s. Catholicism in France died in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and in the mid-20th century, so it keeps dying, but because it's Catholicism is a branch of Christianity, whatever dies keeps coming back to life in a way. If these people hear this joke, they might find this funny at some moment, but they do not speak English because they are precisely the Gaul. They are like them. They are the Gaulish resistance against American invasion. So speaking English is considered to be a sin by the educated Frenchman, because it's the language of the invader. Because in the view of De Gaulle and Pétain and Hitler, De Gaulle, Pétain and Hitler, they had in common their lack of sympathy for the British and the English. I mean, De Gaulle was exiled and found a refuge. Although there were already refugees back then, he found refuge in England, but he accused the American D-Day, I don't know, call this le débarquement, of being an invasion. For them, the Americans invaded France. They did not liberate France, they invaded France. He was opposed to the English, and he tried to make peace with the English, but yeah. So yeah, these people, they consider that American culture is decadent and it's negative, whatever. But so here you have people who have remained Catholics throughout the second half of the 20th century, even though Catholicism had died. And so here you have the Islamophobic theatrical far left, like Charlie Hebdo, who have kept for decades criticizing the Catholic Church. But here's a left-wing sociologist, Mr. Todd, who uses the expression zombie Catholics. Namely, it's an expression to talk about left-wing Catholics, which are bourgeois white people who are vaguely Catholics, and in his view they are zombies because well, they are not really religious, they are not really yeah, they are kind of brain dead in his view, whatever. But here we have real reactionary Catholics. So in the view of these people, if you are a Catholic, you have to be a traditionalist. So most Catholics in France, in quantitative determination of number, they are not in the cosmopolitan elite, but they are the people would be here. If you have to divide the people, you have the people in the middle, the people, the right-wing people, and the left-wing people. And the Catholics, they would be here. Most of Catholics in France, they are leftist. But here, for those people, to be a Catholic means to be a traditionalist, mainly to be a right-winger, and that's why they respect Pétain, who was the last attempt to restore a traditionalist order in France. So the last traditionalist French statesman, one might say, and the last strong statesman. He was a right-winger. He was a right-winger as well, but he was a nationalist, although not a racial nationalist, but he was a nationalist, and he was a patriot. The distinctions here are subtle, because of course there have been military, political opposition, but it's difficult to classify De Gaulle because he's a, I will not talk about De Gaulle, but he's a kind of a right-wing conservative, but not a reactionary in a way. He is a conservative, right-wing, not a soft conservative, a hard conservative, but not hard to the point of being reactionary, in the negative sense, one might say. So here you have old school Catholics. I'm not sure that he's a Catholic, but these are some sort of brilliant intellectuals who are here militant Catholics, intellectuals who are secondarily Catholics, pop culture, modern, over-the-top Catholic. He would be kind of an alt-light figure if he was in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. if he spoke English, he would be in the alt-right. It's kind of some sort of a, I wouldn't say Milo Yiannopoulos because they are so different on many levels, but it's kind of a, I do not compare him to Milo Yiannopoulos. It's a sense that he's just a character. He's larger than life. He knows how to talk, basically. But of course, his political views are completely different. It's just, I took one example, but it's larger than life, as we call this, the character. And here it's modern. Here is a nationalist libertarian, Monsieur de Lesquin, nationalist libertarian, secondarily Catholic. Here the distinction is substance and accidents, essence inessential, but Hegel would say they are united. But for these people, Catholicism is really the most important defining identity. For these people as well, for him it would be nationalism, libertarianism, and partly Catholicism. So these two people, they are a new they represent a new generation of Catholics who have developed on the internet, and he as well. But he is Adrien Abozit is the revival of French Catholicism. He's really a reactionary Catholic, and I talked earlier about the fall, the Christian myth of the fall. For these people, it's a neoliberalism, a Maastricht Treaty, the betrayal of Sarkozy, etc. For these people, the fall, the same thing. It's neoliberalism. For him, the fall is when France ceased to try to assimilate immigrants and adopted multiculturalism, although officially France is not multicultural, but for him, his struggle is a struggle against multiculturalism in the name of assimilation. Namely, immigrants should assimilate culturally completely to France. That's why Zemmour is an ambiguous figure, because he's Jewish, but he's really a right-wing. He's really right-wing. Like he doesn't talk about ethnicity or race because he himself is not white, but actually he does, and he defends the white heterosexual males, and this is one of the tragicomical. It's kind of comical, but it's also part of tragic. Namely, that he was for a very long amount of years, he was one of the only voices within the system, within the media, of really right-wing ideas. But he was not considered to be dangerous because he was and still is Jewish. But actually, that's kind of a very speculative trick. Namely, he's Jewish. His origin is Jewish, but he's not a manipulator. He's really a French nationalist in a way. Culturally he's completely French, and if he was not Jewish, he would not have been allowed to express himself in the media for so many years. Namely, he's a non-white who advocates right-wing white ideas, basically. That's why he's a hero to many right-wing whites, but also he's annoying for the far-right bourgeoisie and for the party, the neo-Nazi, because they accuse him of being Jewish. But the courage of Mr. Zemmour cannot be doubted, and his intelligence neither. So these people, when they criticize him, they are kind of resentful. I do not say that all of them do, but some of them criticize Zemmour because he's of Jewish origin. But these people are not allowed to express their ideas in the public sphere because they are white, and he has been and was allowed, but he no longer is because he's not white. So that's why anti-Semitism is not consistent, because here we have an example of a Jewish Frenchman who has defended and advocated the ethnic interests of the white population, and he has been the only vector of right-wing ideas throughout many years. But anyway, so another, in case it's not clear, but probably I will have clarify this. There are constant conflicts within these spheres at all levels, namely because the particular what is most identical is most different, and what is most different is most identical. It's a conceptual speculative unity, namely these people, classical reactionary Catholics, they do not care about the struggles. They do not care about the struggles between the Marxists, because the Marxists are so different from them that, from this perspective, all Marxists are identical because they are different. But there are bitter conflicts within the far-right fringes. It happens in every country. It's a universal political truth, probably. The closer you get, the more bitter the struggle, because what is most identical is most different. Namely, these people, they keep arguing with one another bitterly, sometimes over insignificant details, but which become significant because of logical determination. That's why what is most identical is most different, and what is most different is most identical. That's logical, speculative logic. This is why Hegel's philosophy enables to understand politics, and yeah. So these are new generation Catholics which spread Catholic values, and we find this in the even American and Canadian world. Robin Riley and what's his name? Michael Jones. But Robin Riley, she's a Catholic. I think she's Canadian. Maybe she will hear about Mr. Abozit. They are the revival of the Catholic spirit in modernity, thanks to the spread of the internet. Yeah. Here you have these people, old right-wing pagans. Namely, it's a distinction of generation. So the distinction between these people and these people in the sphere of Catholicism is the same here in the sphere of paganism. You have old-fashioned paganism who have remained faithful to paganism before the advent of the internet, and the modern view of paganism. And of course, these people are more spiritual because they have had access to more information. But these people have been pagans during decades in which being a pagan was completely anonymous, and now they are becoming more widespread, and their works are becoming widespread in the Anglo-Saxon world as well. Caroline Emmerich has heard about Claude Lecouteux, not Claude Lecoteau. If someday, somehow, Caroline watches this, Caroline, your pronunciation of Lecoteau is terrible. It's Lecouteux, not Lecoteau, but whatever. Yeah. The Marie Cachet, etc. So these people are really spiritual. So this is the young. I mean, they are in their 30s, but they have grown up with the internet. The young revival of paganism, and here the young, the same. They are in their 30s. The young revival of Catholicism. So the Catholics, they disagree with the pagans on many topics, but at the same time they agree on many other topics, because both are opposed to the scarecrow right, to the far right for various reasons. Because for these people are not respectable because they talk about race, and these people, they are too soft. These people, they accuse consciously or unconsciously the far right of bringing the reputation of paganism into disrepute because of their Nazi fantasies. And for these people, for the pagans, these people, they are all part of the system. The Catholics have been the historical oppressors of paganism. So there are conflicts everywhere. And I know it's true of every Western country, and maybe every country where there is a relative amount of freedom, the bitter struggle, the political struggle. And that's why you understand why the libertarians, they are just tired of all this nonsense sometimes, and they just want to abolish politics. Because the ideal of libertarianism, as well as the ideal of Marxism, is to abolish politics. Because politics can be very exhausting. So here you have the pagans, and these two are probably the most spiritual, some of the most spiritual people in France. Here you have conspiracy theorists. He's a Catholic, he's a conspiracy theorist, and she deals with the banking system. So they are very clear-minded about what has been happening, but none of them mentions the question of ethnicity, so they kind of miss an aspect of the question. And here you have the new generation right-wingers, which means people who have grown up with the internet and access to information, who would like to be respectable. So they are kind of torn apart between the threat of the deplorables, as the Americans, as Hillary Clinton would call them. These are deplorable people in the standards of the system, and these people, they basically, they would like partly to adopt some of their ideas about ethnic preservationism, but they do not speak this publicly because they know that this would be social suicide. So they try to appeal to the fashionable, respectable, anti-system right wing, but they are ambiguous in a sense that these people, they are intelligent. He's a real, how do you call this? Handsome. He's a handsome Frenchman. Maybe American women or Anglo-Saxon women or any kind of women will know about Monsieur Rochedy, who is a un beau gosse, comme on dit en français. A handsome. The women would say he's very hot, and he's a very educated Frenchman, right-winger. He talks about Nietzsche. He's a seducer. He might be dangerous, but at least he's seducing, at least for women, I think. Yeah. And yeah, these people, now a little bit more seriousness. These people, they are modern right-winger. They would be classified as, if we had to translate this into the Anglo-Saxon world, the right-wing alt-right or respectable alt-right. I mean, not because they are less radical than the alt-right, but these would be, if it had to be translated into categories of Anglo-Saxon life. I mean, I talk to everyone, but at this moment I speak in English to try to communicate eventually with people of Anglo-Saxon countries, but eventually it's universal. But what I mean is that in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is actually the world at large, but the categories of alt-right, these people would be the right-wing alt-right, in the sense that they do not openly talk about ethnicity, but it's on their mind, basically. They are hidden white nationalists, one might say, but they want to be respectable, so they do not talk about ethnicity, race, anthropology. They try to talk about the question without mentioning it too much, so they are in a difficult position. And they know that if they started to talk about the Great Replacement, etc., or the JQ, they would be excluded from a respectable conversation. So yeah, that's why they try to rehabilitate right-wing values in politics and morality, but without falling into the trap of white nationalism, basically. So that's why some of them try to resuscitate fascism, because Nazism is morally bankrupt, but fascism is not as bad in the collective psyche as Nazism. Nietzschean politics, libertarianism. So this is a wannabe white nationalist modern right without mentioning white nationalism, basically. And that's a problem that many right-wingers in the Western world suffer from. Yeah, and here are some intelligent people that I don't know really how to classify. So they are simply intelligent. I'm not even sure that he's a right-winger, but he seems to be smart, so yeah. And now we have the far right on the French scene. And these people, they have been influenced by Anglo-Saxon thought, namely sociobiology, basically, and the access of information. So they have grown and developed intellectually because of the spread of information, like them. So the new generation, like them, and partly like them. But here they have, yeah. So these people, they are really, they are not Anglo-Saxon anthropologically, but they are alt-right, basically. They know about the alt-right, and they are white nationalists. And yeah, what I want to say is that the irony is that the people on the left who go on the far left of the system, they become far right because they defend the interests of the working class, but because the working class is still predominantly white, indirectly they defend the interests of whites, not because they are white, but because they are working class or middle class. So the far left of the system becomes de facto far right, and the reverse is also true. And this is, I'm sure it's universal, or at least it's widespread in Western countries. Here, the far right of the right-wing opposition, they are not far left, but actually they are, because from a sociological background, these people, they come from working class families, most of them, and they advocate ideas which benefit consciously or unconsciously the white working class. So they try to appeal to the white working class. So this is what Americans would call white trash, basically. Not all of them, he's intelligent, but most of these people, or the people who are attracted by their ideas, they are what Americans call white trash, namely white working class nationalists. So on the far left, you have right-wingers, and on the far right, you have left-wingers, in the sense that these people, they are opposed to communism as an international doctrine, but actually they are socialist nationalists. They are neo-Nazi, basically. So they are on the far right, but they economically and even culturally, they are kind of leftist. They fight for the people. That's what they think. And here you have a divide which is economic and sociological. Here you have white trash in American language. That's kind of the way that white people insult one another. White people are not allowed to insult blacks using the N-word in the American life, but black people can insult one another, and the same goes for whites. Namely, white are allowed to insult one another, to say to a white person, if you're white, you are a white trash, it's okay. Because that's the same logic. What is most identical is most different. What is most different is most identical. You respect people who are different from you, and you insult those who are close to you because you feel that they are a part of you, basically. So that's why white working class nationalists, it's the kind of people that are attracted by far right ideologies in the entire Western world. In America, this would be James Mason, Pierce, etc., etc. And here you have the class divide. You have the far right bourgeoisie. So these people, they come from the working class, so they talk openly about the problems that they envision. And these people, they try to be respectable, like them. So they try to be respected by the intellectual and sociological elite. So they do not really talk about race. They talk only about race, but without talking about it too much. The Great Replacement, Mr. Camus, he does not really talk about race. He does talk without talking. That's why it's very Hegelian. These people, the far-right bourgeoisie, they want some of them to enjoy the benefits, the material prosperity of being within the system. And some of them have been working for the system for decades, for their entire career. And now that they are out of the system because of retirement, they are allowed to express some of their ideas. So here there is a bitter conflict between the white proletarians and the white bourgeoisie. So the conflict here is bitter, and so is the conflict between Catholics and pagans, between those who want to be respectable and those who don't give a F, as Eminem would say. And these people, for instance, who are, in a sense, the good guys because they bring balance and stability. They keep. I will here illustrate because it's very useful to understand the political life. So these people, I simplify, they are, they try to be balanced. They try to accept the realities of modern life, namely that there have been massive demographic changes and cultural changes. They try to negate the negative changes while preserving the changes which, because they belong to reality, they are part of reality, so they try to find a compromise between the new demographics of France and the new culture of France and the new technological, economic, the new determinations of the country, while at the same time remaining not compromising on certain, what they consider good political ideas, namely virtue, civic virtue, collectivism in a good sense. They are not communists, but the idea that in order to have a healthy political life, there has to be a certain amount of collective life. So these are kind of the good guys. They try to solve very difficult problems by being moderate, but their enemies, because if you are in a political game, you have to find enemies, they criticize the lumpen proletariat, namely the desocialized immigrants, namely the criminals, drug addicts, welfare recipients, etc., which are they are a tiny minority, but they exist nonetheless, and they are a noisy, not a a noisy minority. So these people who try to find balance and to be faithful to maybe the best of French politics in the second half of the 20th century, they attack the lumpen proletariat, which is a Marxist category, namely the desocialized immigrants. They attack the most caricatural, which have become sometimes comical aspect of the left, but they want respectability, so they do not attack some of the cosmopolitan elites. So they aim their attacks at the weakest elements of the non-native population from a demographic standpoint, the most caricatural elements of the white leftists, also the non-white nationalists. Also, I could have said, here are non-nationalist whites, and here are non-white nationalists, and they are on the same team, because non-nationalist white promote nationalism for non-white. That's very Hegelian, that's why they complement one another, up to a certain extent, because when they become too nationalist, they are excluded by the system, basically. But yeah, these people who try to be the voice of reason and stability and balance, they attack the lumpen proletariat, the underclass, basically. They attack the caricatures of white leftism, namely white leftist insanity, intellectual, what we call intellectual degeneracy, which is a part of the white psyche. That this is what it's an aspect of the white psyche, namely to become sometimes a little bit crazy. It could be worse, because there are dangerous forms of craziness that we find here sometimes, and there are comical, for lack of a better word. Sometimes the most hysterical liberal leftists, if they are not dangerous, they are just comical. So they attack the lumpen proletariat, the eccentricities of white leftists, and they attack the caricature of the system, the intellectual of the system, without talking about ethnical determinations. And also, so they have to attack on the left. They have three enemies on the left: the white leftist insanity, the lumpen proletariat, and it's also partly white leftist insanity, but here it's really insane. Here it's deception in a way. So they attack on three fronts on the left, and on the right they attack the libertarians in a diplomatic and peaceful manner, because they are not socialist, but they are statist in a way. Not socialist but statist. So they attack, and that's a very old debate in European classical thought, namely the politics versus commerce. Carl Schmitt versus Stuart Mill, Anglo-Saxon individualism, basically. So they are not fervent readers of Carl Schmitt, but basically they defend a political vision of life, while these people, they defend a non-political, commercial vision of life. So their enemies on the right, and it's a universal determination of political thought. Those who approve of politics, namely who accept the struggle of politics, and those who try to alleviate or to negate completely the struggle. So they struggle on the right against the soft right-wingers, the free market economists. They try to seduce the Catholics, but they struggle viciously against what would be, if there is a lumpen proletariat among the immigrants, there is a lumpen proletariat among the natives, and I'm not talking about these individual people, but the kind of people who are attracted by neo-Nazi, basically, are most often white lumpen proletariat, what in America called white trash. So they struggle viciously, not viciously, bitterly, but sometimes it can be vicious, but bitterly and ferociously sometimes, against the white lumpen proletariat, one might say, and they are more brutal against the white underclass than the non-whites, precisely because of the logic of identity difference, etc. And also they struggle against the far-right bourgeoisie, which they accuse of being decadent and promoting class hatred, basically. So that's the kind of these people who try to be the consensus and the voice of the middle. So in a way, they are the good guys, but it's difficult to be the good guy. They accuse and they attack the caricatures of the left, of the immigrants, of the system, of the far right, of the bourgeoisie. So basically, they attack everyone in order to remain stable in the middle. And I know that this exists in probably most Western countries. Namely, these people, they really are in a difficult position and they handle the difficulty pretty well. They make errors, but the people on the right, they accuse them of being too soft, of compromising with what they consider to be the enemy. So it's very complicated, but they try to solve a lot of problems, so credit to them. And I know that this exists in most Western countries. I mean, I'm sure that in England, in America, in Canada, there are people, mostly of the young generation or sometimes of the old, who try to find a voice of compromise and reason and to try to appease as much tension as possible while being severe sometimes against really the dangerous elements of political life. And there can be physical danger or intellectual danger at various levels. So yeah, so that's why they are they try to solve difficult situation by using reason, and they are strong intellectually. Credit has to be given to them, and I know that this exists in one way or another in every Western country. Namely, the people in the alt-right, I mean, they are not alt-right, but probably in the alt-right there are people who are genuinely trying to solve the problems of how do we incorporate westernized immigrants. They are already incorporated. So how do we preserve the good aspect of Western civilization and in its universality? How do we seduce the immigrants or descendants of immigrants who have not fully assimilated, while convincing them to remain faithful to their native faith or native way of life, but distantiating themselves from the most problematic elements of their communities, like these people, basically the neo-Nazi, are the most problematic elements of the white community. And that's why the people who are attracted by these kind of ideas, usually they are forced to live with these people, and there are bitter conflicts and even violence, and it's here determined by ethnicity, anthropology, culture, sociology. So that it's difficult. So there are people who try to solve genuinely complex problems by using the voice of reason, and it's difficult, but and that's what I could say. And finally, I will comment about the historical figures. So here are the heroic defender of France who lost against Caesar, but who resisted against Caesar, the first hero of France, but when France was Gaul. So it's a Celtic, Gaulish hero, and here's the first French hero, because it is through how do you call this? But being baptized, the conversion of Clovis, a Frankish king, namely a Germanic king, who converted to Catholicism and made France a Catholic country, basically united France under Catholicism. Charlemagne, hero and villain, depending for the pagans. Charlemagne is a villain. For the Christians, it's partly a hero, but at least it's a very important figure in French and German and European life. Saint Louis and the Crusades. So here is another problem, because Saint Louis historically has been a hero of the right, and he's a villain for the Muslims because he was a crusader. So that's one of the problems that the system is trying to solve. Joan of Arc nationalist hero. She's a hero for nationalists, but the system tries to make her a symbol of mixed race culture. It happened a few years ago. A non-white lady was used to embody Joan of Arc, which created controversies because Joan of Arc is a symbol of resistance against those. I will not use the word that I would like to use. Those English, very annoying, these English sometimes. The resistance against the English, but in the context of modernity, France is not being invaded by the English, but depending where you situate, France is being invaded by globalism, woke ideology, cosmopolitan ideology, being invaded by invaders from this perspective, being invaded by American culture. So the problem is that if you try to take Joan of Arc seriously, you become a real opposition, basically. Louis XIV, Napoleon, so here I will not comment, but Louis XIV, he's considered to be the king of France at the peak of its power in the 17th century when France dominated Europe and was the most prosperous, I'm not sure, but powerful militarily and demographically and culturally country in Europe and probably in the world, if we accept China back then, but the most powerful country in Europe when Europe was not at the peak, but very powerful. The peak of European power probably is in the 19th century when Europe dominated the whole world, but up until 1914 basically. But he is considered to be not the greatest, because then there are what does it mean to be great? Does it mean that you bring happiness to the people or greatness to the nation? That's the division, the French division between the left and the right in the classical view. Namely, a leftist historical figure is someone who brings happiness to the people. A great right-wing figure is someone who brings greatness to the nation. That's why these people are on the right. And the intellectuals of the system, just to illustrate, they want to deconstruct everything French, like every intellectual of every Western country tries to deconstruct everything which is native of the native country, except the native populations of the Native Americans. But what is here is difficult precisely because there is a distinction between Northern America and Eastern Europe, Western Europe. But basically, deconstructionism is the intellectual tool of the system. So there have been intellectuals who have tried and trying to deconstruct Louis XIV, which is very easy because there was partly slavery, because he was a king. He was the figure of the king is despised in France by everyone except the Catholics. So here you have royalists. It's written in French, but royalists, they think that let us bring back the king, somehow any king, and even Martin Luther King, maybe. Okay, no, that's not very funny. Maybe it is funny actually, because there are racial tension in France, so maybe Martin Luther King would help the French. But they want to bring a king because they think, okay, in order to solve all the problems, just introduce monarchy and everything will fall back into place and be ordered. That's a little bit simple, but yeah. And yeah, also I will talk about the royalists. Here, the royalists, they are Catholic because traditionally France has been a monarchy and a Catholic country, but they are anti-racist and they like to play the race card against the English. They like to play against the French psyche in its opposition to the English. Because of the historical struggles between the French and the English. So these royalists, like most Catholics, when they don't know who to attack, they attack the English, and they accuse the English of scheming and manipulation and being genocidal maniacs, because we, the French, we preserved the natives in Canada and even in parts of the US when there were Frenchmen in Louisiana, in the southern parts of what would later become the American territory. So the relationship between the French explorers and the natives of the American continent and some islands of the Pacific were peaceful, whereas they accused the English of being brutal, genocidal maniacs. Basically, the Anglo-Saxon, they killed the native Indians. So white people, they use non-whites to struggle against one another. These people, they use the race card against the English. I mean, they do not talk to English, but they use the race card basically to say, but the modern world is a product of the Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons are evil because look what they did. They enslaved blacks, they slaughtered the native Indians, we, the Catholics, we protected, whatever, which is partly true, but yeah, because it's partly true that non-whites have been treated better in a way by Catholics, by Catholic whites than by Protestant whites. It's an embarrassing historical truth, but yeah. So yeah, they play the race card, and they try to resurrect. That's also very Hegelian, very Nietzschean. In order to have a struggle, you have to find an opponent to struggle against. So these people, they are trying to bring back the old feud, the old struggle against the English, because in their views, Pétain was struggling against the English. The people on the far right, they bring up the Jewish question, they struggle against the Jews, and these people, they struggle against the Germans because they accuse the Germans of stealing the sovereignty, the monetary sovereignty of the French, of forcing what they call ordo-liberalism, which means authoritarian liberalism and strict economic control of the monetary policy upon the European Union, which is dominated economically by the Germans. So they accuse the Germans of ruining Southern Europe, so they ally themselves with Southern Europe, which is Latin, so they bring back the old Latin Nordic divide, so that the French, here I will talk about the view of the Catholic and the far right. Maurassien means a reference to Charles Maurras, who was a French nationalist. The problem of France, which is anthropological and geographical, historically, is that it's partly Nordic, partly Germanic. The northern part of France is Germanic culturally and anthropologically even, and geographically in a way. And the southern part is culturally Latin, which means Greek, Roman, and then partly Italian and Spanish in a way. Not Spanish, but in the sense that Greek and Roman, but the language, French language, is derived from Latin, and it has a lot in common with Italian and Italian and Spanish, because they are all Latin derived languages, derived from the Latin language, whereas German and English are partly influenced by Latin, Greek, and French, but especially the English language. But these are Germanic languages, and although the German language has remained more Germanic than the English language, but there are cultural, linguistic, anthropological, geographical divide, because France is divided geographically, anthropologically, and culturally, and historically between the south and the north, and some right-wing nationalists, royalist Catholics, they want to play not the race card, but the linguistic card, namely to imagine a Latin unity. And this is the kind of idea that these people are trying to resurrect, namely the idea that France is a Latin country, whereas in the view of some other people, it's partly a Nordic country. That's the view of Oleg. In the northern part of France, Normandy, it had been populated and still has been populated by Norsemen, descendants of Vikings, basically. And the northern part of France has been and still is populated in the white population by descendants of Germanic people. That's why France is divided anthropologically. Here I talk about the native French population is divided anthropologically, culturally, etc. So these people they bring back the conflict with the English, and these people they bring back the conflict with the Germans, and most people bring back the conflict with the Americans, because when you don't know who to attack the Americans, you accuse them of promoting degenerate culture, degenerate ways of life, vices of all sorts, pornography, tobacco, Coca-Cola, fashion, television, whatever. You can accuse the Americans of anything. That's what the French do all day long, basically. So here it's just an illustration of Hegelian logic, namely, in order to have a meaningful struggle to lead, these people, they are forced to resurrect the old German-French struggle, whereas the entire system tries to bring peace between the French and the German by erasing the French and German population, whether demographically or culturally. That's one way of solving the problem, because if there are no longer any Frenchmen and no longer any German, there can be no conflicts. But it's maybe a little bit excessive, and maybe that's not the proper way of solving problems. But anyway, so yeah, that's just an illustration. And I know it's universal because the English, probably there are English fringe nationalist circles who say, oh, we suffer because of those damn Irish or Scots or whatever. There are probably fringes, circles in the nationalist Irish sphere who says, the English, they are responsible for all our miseries. We should never have settled on this island, whatever. I'm sure that, yeah. Probably there are conflicts in Spain between various regions of Spain, in Italy between the north and the south. Yeah. The Germans, I'm sure that there are fringe German nationalist circles who say the French, the eternal enemy of Germany, more threatening than the Slavs. Yeah, I can only imagine that this kind of infinite complexity of struggle, sometimes meaningful, sometimes just a waste of time and meaningless. I mean, not because all in all, everything has its reason for being, but I just illustrate because I know, because of my empirical self, how to divide. But these are just illustrations, and then only an empirical person of any other country can understand through his own experience the structure, basically. So yeah, I continue. So here I was talking about Napoleon, Louis XIV. So the system tries to deconstruct Louis XIV because he's a source of pride for the right wing, and they want to abolish all sense of accomplishment by the French population because, yeah. So Louis XIV is associated with the idea of greatness for France, cultural, military, geopolitical, demographic strength, and so is Napoleon. That's why these are ambiguous figures. They have been heroes, and also Louis XIV was never really a villain because, from an absolute standpoint, he's the greatest king. One might say he's the king of France at the peak of its power. Napoleon was the emperor, but the empire didn't last very long, whereas Louis XIV really was the most stable king when France was at the peak of its power, culturally, demographically, geopolitically, militarily, etc. So yeah, but these really are the most important figures. I made this by copying a dictionary, but there are many more. But really, this is a French history in the 10. How many are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 names. There could be more, but yeah. The French Revolution, the most important figure would be Robespierre, but there are more moderate, and there were factions, so that's why it's difficult to classify. And also François I, Henry IV, etc. They could be added here, but with the struggles between the Catholic and the Protestant, between the French and the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Germanic Roman Empire, France and Italy, etc., 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 whatever. Inventors, they're just one, but there are many more. Intellectuals, he's a nationalist, an anti-Semite. Tocqueville, he's very famous in America. There are many intellectuals like Bastia, Say, Tocqueville, and even probably Charles Gave, Pascal Salin, who are more well known outside of France because their ideas are not very popular, because they are libertarians mostly. Here are right-wing historians, right-wing authors. Good literature, it is said in France, is right-wing. Poetry, I put this on the right, but actually poets are beyond left and right. They are just creative, artistic genius. So here are great poets. Romantic, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, they are very difficult to classify. It cannot be classified. It's just a great French poetry. Spiritual people, Jean Calvin, which, like the libertarians and the Protestants have had a very important influence upon American and Swiss here, but also American partly life. But he's been very influential in Switzerland. Bastia has been very influential in America. Tocqueville as well. Where is Tocqueville? Here. So there are many French people who have been very influential outside of their own native country. Like Rousseau was a Swiss who became tremendously influential upon French life and eventually European life and even world spirit, because Rousseau has been a tremendous influence for Marx, for nationalism, for communism, for socialism, a literary influence, an artistic influence, an aesthetic influence, political, philosophical, an influence on education. He's been one of the most influential men ever, for good or bad, because he was a conflicted figure, but he's been influential on the far left and the far right. So Jean Calvin, Guénon, Savitri Devi. I didn't know that she was officially French, at least a citizen, but yeah, I did not know that. But yeah, and here a scholar of spirituality, and here most important French philosophers in a chronological order. Abelard, Héloïse and Abelard, the famous story. So these are Middle Ages. No, he's a Middle Age thinker. Renaissance thinker. Modernity, he's a materialist. Epicurean, materialist. Descartes, of course, tremendously influential. Blaise Pascal, influential upon Nietzsche, was a Christian thinker. He could not finish his work. He left only notes. Les Pensées, which are fragments of an unfinished book. A scientist. So here we are Middle Age, Renaissance, basically. I simplify. 17th century, the classical age. From an intellectual standpoint, this may be France at the peak of its classical, artistic, and intellectual expression. But actually, France has had a very rich intellectual life already in the Renaissance, partly, but it was more influential in Italy. But in the 17th century, which is the classical age, where the greatest writers, thinkers, and even partly scientists, because Blaise Pascal was a philosopher but a scientist as well, Malebranche was a metaphysician. So it's really the age of the classical age. And then there is the 18th century in France, which is also a classic, one might say, but not a classicism. It's classic in the sense that maybe it's the most famous century in the history of France, but the 17th century was great as well, intellectually, and the 19th century as well. But here's the age of enlightenment. So Montesquieu, very influential upon political theory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was an anti-enlightenment thinker, surrounded by enlightenment thinkers. We have a deist, theist, materialist, Diderot, Helvétius, d'Alembert, Voltaire, Condillac, Lamétrie, d'Holbach, Condorcet. They are all materialists or theists, but basically they are anti-metaphysicians. And that's what this brought about, the German reaction with Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and eventually Hegel. The age of enlightenment, the spread of knowledge, the development of public opinion, the spread of bourgeois idea, political liberalism, economic liberalism, anti-metaphysics, anti-clergy, and eventually anti-religion. Here are a liberal thinker, positivism, which is the triumph, the ideological triumph of scientism, basically. Vitalism, a scientist, epistemological science plus psychoanalysis, existentialism, Marxism, Heideggerian influence, a lot of contradictory thoughts, Marxist epistemology. It's not very clear. It's complicated. And these people, Marxism, psychoanalysis, cultural Marxism in a way, French theory, deconstructionism, whatever, more or less deconstructionism, postmodernism, the same sociology, left-wing sociology, theory of imitation, a friend of Zizek, Onfray is the philosopher I've talked about, anti-Hegelian, therefore Hegelian, and good old philosophy teachers or writers of histories of philosophy. So only a Frenchman or an expert in the history of philosophy can know this, but yeah, broadly this is the story of French philosophy. And then I could, if I did this very briefly, but I did not consciously wanted to implement all the artists, movie directors, painters, etc., etc., sportsmen, comedians, etc., etc. But this is basically the spiritual life and intellectual life of modern France, which is a particular type of country. And okay, problem. Yeah, I will just show. So basically, I've talked for 3 hours now. This is how to understand a country. I did not work on this thoroughly because I've spent most of the past 5 months reading Hegel every day, but I just classified with my personal experience of the life of the intellectual life of this country. And most of the categories are ordered. I mean, it's not spatial. They can be interchanged in many ways, but this is broadly the structure. And this video, when I publish this video, it will be very useful for anyone watching this video to understand the French political life, because this is how people are determined to think what they think, to interact reciprocally, etc. This is the broad view and of course it has to be completed. This is just my view that I made briefly, but this is the life of the French country, basically. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I had to say. So I will just reread my notes, basically. I think I've said most of what I said. Yeah, just I read my notes briefly, things that I've not mentioned. The motto of the nationalist, liberal or libertarian party of Monsieur de Lesquen is individual liberty, civic equality, racial brotherhood. So it's liberty, equality, fraternity or brotherhood, liberty, equality, fraternity. But here it's specifically determined, as Hegel would say. It's not the Allgemeinheit, it's the Besonderung des Allgemeinheit, so it's the particularization of the universal. So it's not any kind of liberty, it's individual liberty. So he's a libertarian. It's civic equality and not economic equality. So that's why he's a libertarian in the sense that he doesn't aim at equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And it's racial fraternity and not universal fraternity. So that's why he's a nationalist libertarian. And it's contradictory, but yeah, that's just to illustrate. Liberty, equality, fraternity is the motto of the French Republic. Here it's a Hegelian modification, namely it's a Besonderung der Allgemeinheit, a particularization of the universal. Namely, it's not abstract universal liberty, abstract universal equality, or abstract universal fraternity. It's individual liberty, civic equality, and racial fraternity. So it's the equivalent of white nationalist libertarians in the Anglo-Saxon world, basically. And one of his mottos is no enemies on the right, which the left, it's like a common implicit agreement between leftists, that leftists, they all agree to say we have no enemies on the left except when they become right-wingers. But the leftists in the system, they are willing to cooperate with the communists, the anarchists, the lumpen proletariat, the anti-colonialists, the Islamophiles, the Islamophobes. With any kind of leftist, there is no limit to the radicalization of the left, but the right are not allowed because of the moral dominance of the left in the Western world, they are not allowed to make deals or to cooperate with the right. So if you are, whatever kind of right-winger you are already too extreme, and going further right is even worse. You are worsening the situation. But the motto of Mr. Doleskin is no enemies on the right, which means basically, officially, we promote, that's what he thinks, basically, officially we promote libertarian nationalism, but actually it means that if on the right, and actually he's not idiot, he knows that on the right, basically there are neo-Nazis. He says no enemies on the right, which the left is allowed to do this because of the moral reasons of the second half of the 20th century, but the right is not allowed. That's a universal determination of the Western political life. Namely, every right-winger in any Western country is not allowed morally by the dominant left to associate with people on the right. The conservative in America are not allowed to associate themselves with the hard Republicans. The hard Republicans are not allowed to associate with white nationalists. The alt-right are not allowed morally to associate with the alt-right. The respectable libertarians are not allowed to associate with the hardcore libertarians. So if you are a right-winger, even a moderate one, you are already in sin, and the further right you go, the worse it gets from the moral standpoint of the left. This is how it works. Yeah. Yeah. I said pretty much what I had to say. So yeah, it's not very rigorous, but that's what I could say. And yeah, this is how to understand a country. And I repeat, empirically, I can only understand France, and theoretically, I can potentially, if given the time, the opportunity, I could understand any country anywhere. But it requires to read a lot of books or to watch a lot of videos. But I think I understand the United States of America very well. But actually, I cannot fully understand the US because I'm not a native cultural American. My intellectual life is just cultural appropriation, stealing Anglo-Saxon ideas and American culture. Basically, I'm just a cultural appropriator. It's cultural appropriation at its highest intensity. Namely, I owe most of my ideas to Americans. But actually, then I discovered Hegel, and I realized that actually I owe them to the Germans. But yeah. So yeah, that's what I could say about the intellectual and spiritual life of France. And yeah, I will stop there now, and I will publish this video eventually when the time is adequate, with an introduction to make it interesting maybe. And